Welcome to the Green Hydrogen 2021 Roundtable of Sustainable Westchester. First, housekeeping. This is a not the webinar zone. That means that everyone can actually speak and talk, but everyone is muted upon entry and hopefully remain unless we ask them to speak. The event is going to be recorded, is being recorded right now. We put an agenda in the chat that anyone can access. There's for each of the speakers and panelists, for the sake of time, we won't introduce any of them, but please feel free to use the LinkedIn links and the bio links that we posted on the agenda for each of these panelists and speakers. Please write your questions in the chat. There's no Q&A, it's a chat, and we're going to post the chat and use that to answer all the questions, even if during the event possible. If not, after the event, we'll communicate these answers to you by questioning the relevant participants. So at the end of this event at around 4 o'clock, after the Q&A of panel 2, we will let the participant in, unmute themselves, and it's going to be open mic, as you say. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce our executive director, Nina Arville, who is going to explain what Sustainable Westchester. Nina, you're muted.
Of course. Thank you, Michel, and good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here joining us for this event today. And I know that Michel will be thanking all the partner organizations associated with this event. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Michel for his leadership in convening this second Hydrogen Roundtable. I'm going to provide a very quick introduction to Sustainable Westchester. Sustainable Westchester is a nonprofit consortium of Westchester County municipalities that facilitates effective collaboration on sustainability initiatives. Our goal is to bring socially responsible, environmentally sound, and economically viable programs to our 45 member municipalities, and to help the county achieve the targets established by the CLCPA. We have a growing portfolio of programs at Sustainable Westchester. These include our community energy programs. First off, Westchester Power, which is the first community choice aggregation program in New York State. It delivers electricity supply to over 115,000 households, about a third of the county. And community solar, we've done the customer acquisition for over 23 megawatts of community solar. And we're also currently partnering with NYPA and Westchester County on a municipal solar aggregation with over 25 participating municipalities. We'll be integrating community solar into the Westchester Power program later this year. Next are our Electrification Solutions, which include clean heating and cooling for both residential and commercial buildings, and clean transportation. Our grid efficiency work is headed by Michel and includes Grid Rewards, the first residential demand response program in the state, and a virtual power plant initiative that aggregates residential solar and battery storage. In addition to these energy-related programs, we also have zero waste programs. So now I'm going to turn it back to Michel to kick off this important discussion about the role that hydrogen can play in helping us achieve our clean energy future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And why Westchester County and why hydrogen? The county is about 1 million inhabitants and generates less than 2% its own electric consumption, mostly from solar. The rest of our energy needs are to be brought in from outside. Electrify everything has its limits. We're already stressing the 130-year-old grid, as we call it, using a old kinetic paradigm of electricity generation and delivery to the point of users. And the grid is very inefficient. We badly need energy storage to change all of this. Sustainable Westchester is gathering a broad audience today and hopes to start a conversation on hydrogen. Hydrogen can play a major role as a form of energy storage. It has a high energy density. It can be used as is or as a feedstock for numerous energy molecules that we can use, and it can be rapidly transferred or as a gas or a liquid. This event here will be structured as a session on speakers that will engage you into what is green hydrogen. There will be a panel following that on the production and storage and all the possibility of direct derivatives as a storage solution. And the panel is like a broad conversation on what and where we're going with this in New York State, what policies and regulations should be in place for that. And we want to thank our partners, in particular, the Alliance for Clean Energy New York. Cal Rabin, who is my partner on this, went fantastic job on this. We want to also thank New York Battery and Storage Consortium, your best. Bill Acker is on this as well, and the Pace Energy and Climate Center, and which is our partner as well on policy and regulation. Now, I want to introduce you to Dr. Nelson of the Green Hydrogen Coalition. Laura, you can unmute yourself, and I'll drive you the slides.
Great, thank you so much, Michel. It's really awesome to be with everyone here today. And Nina, thank you for that excellent overview around what Sustainable Westchester is and what you're up to. You're absolutely to be commended for all the activities that are underway to provide for decarbonized solutions in our power systems. So that's really exciting. And that's what we're up to at the Green Hydrogen Coalition as well. So next slide, please. Our mission really is to facilitate policies and practices that will advance the production and use of green hydrogen as one of those very important tools in all sectors where it will accelerate a carbon-free energy future. And our approach really is to prioritize large projects at scale that can simultaneously leverage supply and demand so that we can realize those multi-sector opportunities. So next slide, please. As Michel mentioned, I mean, the power, if you will, no pun intended, of green hydrogen is that it can, in fact, decarbonize multiple sectors: agriculture, high heat, industrial applications, transportation, power, mining, and the energy sector and energy storage. And hydrogen is not new as a resource in many of these applications. We use it in some transportation today. It's used in industrial applications. It's used in ammonia processes. It isn't largely used in the power sector, and it hasn't been a significant energy storage opportunity, except perhaps as we see more fuel cells deployed. And it's also used in mining. The challenge is that, in fact, most hydrogen produced today is made from fossil resources, so it has a significant carbon footprint. So if we really want to get to decarbonization across multiple sectors, we have to include how we produce this product as well. So next slide, please. So that brings me to our definition of green hydrogen. And we have been, in fact, socializing this in a number of places. In California specifically, there is a bill presently in place, SB 18, and that is where we have defined green hydrogen as a gas that is not produced from fossil feedstocks and does not produce incremental carbon emissions during its primary production process. We've also recently seen this definition adopted in Montana as they have implemented a green hydrogen incentive program. I think has now gone to their governor for signature, and also seeing it socialized across the West today. And hopefully, I think that this definition of green hydrogen can support our decarbonization goals within the power sector and other sectors as well. So I want to focus just a bit on the power sector. Next slide, please, because this is where the big, I think, game-changing potential is today. what we do with storage, right, is we bottle sunshine and wind so that when those renewable resources are producing energy in excess, we can store it and then deliver it later when that energy is needed. The same thing can happen with green hydrogen, except at a much larger scale and for longer duration. And we're seeing a project today happen in the West, which is the conversion of the Intermountain Power project. So I want to tell you just a little bit about this project. Remember, I mentioned our approach is to really focus on these scalable projects so we can provide for multi-sector decarbonization. This is one of those large scalable projects. So next slide, please. Today, the Intermountain Power Project is an 1,800 megawatt coal-fired facility. And that coal-fired facility is going to be decommissioned by 2025 and recommissioned as a combined cycle combustion turbine that will burn green hydrogen on day one of operation. So there will be local production of green hydrogen, and there will be repurposing of infrastructure that is already in place near the Intermountain Power site to provide the resources required for this transformation. There is a large renewable energy system surrounding this particular site. There's already transmission lines in place, significant transmission lines that can provide for delivery of power specifically to California, but to also other off-takers. There's a lot of land and water. The water is going to be important for providing a resource for electrolytic hydrogen production. There are also salt domes located near this site, which can be used for storing the hydrogen, so that long duration energy storage. And there's also an incredible workforce there that can be trained and utilized to provide the skill set that's going to be needed to deliver this project. So this is real time happening. We're talking less than 5 years that this project is going to be decommissioned and recommissioned really as a significant green hydrogen project. So next slide, please. So I've gone over much of this, but I wanted to share this with you so you have it visually and you'll have this presentation available to you later. But I think that really the power of the message here is that as we're looking to transform our energy system, that there are going to be opportunities. And of course, I recognize there are some local specifications around this particular project that make it ideal. But I think it's important as we look at this transformation, how do we use our distribution and transmission systems? What resources do we have locally? Do we have backup generators that can be repurposed with another fuel set? And that's what we did at this particular site. I was energy advisor to the governor of Utah when this project was first envisioned to become a hydrogen project. And we said, what are the resources we have today? How can we leverage those resources to provide a clean energy solution that also can drive economic outcomes across Utah, but also for the West and the users of energy from this particular plant. Next slide, please. And I mentioned already that another part of the assessment was, where is this project located in terms of its access to renewable energy? Because remember, my definition of green hydrogen is that we're not producing in the primary production process incremental carbon. And so what are the resources that you're going to have available to produce that hydrogen to assure that it's green hydrogen? And I already mentioned, of course, there's water at the site that can be used for electrolytic hydrogen production, but there's also a lot of renewable energy in and around this area. And so this project not only supports how we can capture that wind and solar when it's not needed for the system and put it into the production of green hydrogen, which can then be stored and utilized later in a combustion turbine to provide energy back to the grid when it is needed. And so having these renewable resources in the area was an important part of our assessment. And so I see all the work that Sustainable Westchester is doing around realizing increased renewable development. I think that that's super important for how we can drive other clean energy and energy storage opportunities as well. And so this project is going to support that clean energy hub overall and allow for expansion even of this clean energy hub. So next slide, please. So I do want to touch just quickly on the storage, because these salt caverns are unique, and there are salt caverns in other parts of the country. They may not be in New York, but solving the storage solution is an important part of how we can capture this green hydrogen as a long duration energy storage. Hydrogen doesn't degrade, so you can store it for long periods of time, unlike diesel and natural gas, which do degrade over time, and you can release that hydrogen as a fuel for the power sector or for other systems. And so that's another, I think, magical thing, if you will, about this particular site, is that these salt caverns are incredibly large. Think Empire State Building large, if you want a local reference. And so they're quite significant in terms of their ability to store hydrogen. 5,500 plus tons of hydrogen can be stored in one cavern, and there's the potential for over 100 caverns at this particular site. But looking at storage across still containment and other types of options, I think, is also going to be an important part of how we continue to look for long duration energy storage solutions. So next slide, please. So I think that fuel cells can be an important part. I mentioned that, we do see hydrogen used today in some storage, but, I think continuing to look at green hydrogen with fuel cells is going to be an important part of how we find those alternatives to diesel and gas backup generators, specifically for providing resilience on the system and for islanding or microgridding to ensure that we do have that resiliency. And green hydrogen fuel cells can be a clean part of that long duration energy storage solution. As I mentioned, the hydrogen doesn't degrade over time. And so you can have local production and utilization of green hydrogen with fuel cells. So not everything has to be the large scale of the IPP project, and still have the opportunity to provide for a clean energy solution for the grid. So next slide, please. So one of the questions I always get is, well, you say that hydrogen is a globally traded commodity today. It's mostly produced from fossil fuels. Why isn't green hydrogen displacing gray hydrogen at a faster pace? Well, one of the things that has been a factor is the cost considerations. Green hydrogen is, of course, more expensive to produce than what we call gray or brown hydrogen from fossil resources. But the good news is, because of the significant penetration of renewable energy resources, the cost of producing green hydrogen commercially is really coming down. And so this particular graphic, this analysis was done by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, which tends to be a fairly conservative in terms of how it's looking at cost over time. And what they have indicated is that by 2030, that green hydrogen can be cost competitive with fossil-based hydrogen, even blue hydrogen, which includes fossil-based hydrogen production with carbon capture and sequestration. And you'll see these smiley faces on my graph here. I'm going to talk about those in just a minute, but think about those reference points. So we see the cost declining over time. We see cost competitiveness. And I believe there was just recently at the end of March, a Bloomberg New Energy Finance report that came out that I think supports this. But keep an eye on those smiley faces. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the power sector? If we can get the cost of green hydrogen down and then the production cost down, then the delivered costs can follow. And so if we can significantly reduce those delivered costs of green hydrogen for utilization, specifically in this case, in a combined cycle combustion turbine, then we can really effectively provide for a clean energy system in a very holistic way. And so these numbers here are not made up. We actually took the values of the project at the Intermountain Power plant in consultation with their engineers, like, what are you seeing as sort of the whole system cost? And we integrated different cost prices for hydrogen over time. So remember my graph with the smiley faces? IRENA's projections, 2028, we can be at $2 a kg production costs for green hydrogen. What does that mean for the levelized cost of delivering hydrogen? $116 a megawatt hour. Then by 2035, we're down to $1.50. That's $87. 2045, $1.50. $58. And if you think about the cost of having to go out on the market and purchase power when you're having a system challenge, whether it's a winter issue or a summer issue, that cost can be very, very high. So these costs are not out of line with what we might see in the market. And they're certainly, I think, very reasonable in comparison to what you might have to experience if you had to go purchase power in a wholesale market during a particularly system stressed time. And so we said, listen, this all seems very reasonable, but then if you take this and you blend it with all of the renewables that are on the system, because you're going to provide this additional capacity to support dispatch on the system, and so you're going to be blending it with all of those renewable energy resources, which we know are incredibly cheap today, right? And they are the cost competitive option, wind and solar. And if we do a blended analysis, the market rate comes down even further. And so these prices that we have in this last column, $42 by 2028 in terms of a blended cost opportunity for this specific project, is not unimaginable. It actually is real and potential. So scale is going to be critical to bringing down costs. So how do we get to scale? Next slide, please. Well, we have to really come together. We have to come together and work on the various opportunities that exist to utilize green hydrogen. And one of those ways, and I do want to mention this because I think that, there are some questions and challenges around the full energy system. We have to decarbonize multiple energy systems, and that includes the natural gas sector. And so we do see projects occurring across the country today that are going to start producing green hydrogen, injecting it into pipelines that exist today, and moving forward with the process of decarbonizing those systems as well. It won't happen overnight, but I think it's important to recognize and support those projects, because this incremental increase in scaling is going to be fundamental to seeing green hydrogen delivered at scale. So next slide, please. There are also a number of projects that have been announced, and continuing to support all of these projects across the power sector is also going to be very, very important. So this is a list, kind of just a summary, if you will, of projects. Of course, I've talked about the IPP project, which is the largest project of its type in the world, but we also see others that are engaged in piloting or scaled production opportunities for green hydrogen within the power sector to provide for that clean energy solution. So next slide, please. So one of the things that we want to do in terms of bringing people together to kind of socialize these opportunities is looking at these regional collaborations. And so one of the things that the Green Hydrogen Coalition undertook this past year was to partner with some other associations to bring together 11 Western states and 2 Canadian provinces to look at how we can create a green hydrogen roadmap for the region, and also have subsequent green hydrogen roadmaps for states and provinces, because each policy for the states and provinces is going to be unique. But the general kind of message of this is that collaboration and partnership are fundamental to driving the commercial opportunities for green hydrogen. And so that's what we're up to. And this is another significant initiative where you can bring together demand centers and production centers and the intermediate assets to pull together across a full system grid-based approach to delivering green hydrogen. So next slide, please. So practical policy solutions are also going to be really key. There's lack of education. So an important part of what we do at the Green Hydrogen Coalition, we are actually a 501c3, is to provide education. I'd love for you to check out our website. We have a green hydrogen guidebook, the first in kind that we produced to proactively educate stakeholders, policymakers, environmentalists, anyone who's interested in what green hydrogen can do as a game changer in our fight to protect our Earth and address climate change. So we think it's important to continue to address the cost. There are pathways to look at how we can incentivize and encourage demand and production. We need to formally recognize green hydrogen as a resource, and it needs to be modeled in plans, including plans around decarbonization. And we need to make sure that we're providing the appropriate market signals that will encourage investment investment. And again, back to the Western Green Hydrogen Initiative, the fact that the states are coming together in this way, and I think, for Sustainable Westchester, bringing together all of your municipalities to talk about how you can create this as a bankable asset is an important part of sending a signal that, hey, we think this can be a possibility, a solution, and can help to inform and drive these commercial and investment opportunities. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of highlight what I think are the key takeaways. The green hydrogen economy really is here. It's taking off. It's happening around the world. In Europe, certainly they're advancing a lot around injection of green hydrogen into the gas system. They have very specific goals and targets, but it is now here in the United States as well. And the opportunity is real, and we can look to accelerate that so that we can have multi-sector decarbonization and really share in the value that can be provided through this particular resource. Low delivered cost at scale can happen. What we're going to need to do, again, is scale, and that's going to be really important to drive utilization. And storage and transmission are going to be an important part of that. We do believe that these regional targets and coordinating across regions is super important to identify, what are those transmission and distribution opportunities, and how do you optimize that system so you can defer T&D investment and have more efficient outcomes for your customers, because that's really what you want. We do think policy is headed in the right direction, but we need to continue to educate, address key barriers, and make sure that we're driving alignment around the value proposition for green hydrogen, which includes looking at how we're going to compensate, and we can compensate. We've done this for renewable resources for that green attribute that is provided by this resource. And then finally, I think continuing to look at regulatory innovation is going to be important, because that's where we're going to see the rubber hit the road, if you will, for really having these resources accessible to utilities and service providers to meet their energy demands and their challenges. So I think it's a very important solution, and I hope that this is something that you all will consider as you look at your resource mix going forward. So next slide, please. So please, I'd love to stay in touch. I think, Michelle, I can stay on for a bit this morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. I may have to drop off a little bit, but I can perhaps hop back on. But I would love for folks to stay in touch. I mentioned our Green Hydrogen Guidebook. I have really just done a very cursory overview of what's happening in the green hydrogen space, but hopefully, the passion, the commitment, and information has been forthcoming to all of you. So thank you again, Michelle, for letting me connect here on this call today. And I'm looking forward to hearing from other speakers.
Thank you, Doctor. And I will go and transition directly to Rory Christian from Concentric Consulting Group. Rory, can unmute yourself, and I'll drive your side.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And my name is Rory Christian, Principal with Concentric Consulting Group. Very much want to thank Sustainable Westchester and our partners for having this forum today, and particularly Michelle and Kyle for their patience and for organizing this event. I want to build on what Dr. Nelson just said, and kind of reinforce a few points. Hydrogen being a global commodity is an important factor, but also it's important to recognize that America currently produces 1/7 of the global hydrogen trade. So we are one of the major players in this field. Additionally, we are not alone in discussing hydrogen. European Union, Asian countries as well are all looking at hydrogen as a potential diverse resource for including in their climate and energy goals. Next slide, please. So when we look at New York State, we look at the CLCPA, the main thrust is decarbonization. And we all know why we need to decarbonize. But when I think about decarbonization, I think about it in the context of climate change and local air quality. And I particularly think about it in the perspective that generally these two things disproportionately affect disadvantaged and low-income communities. So as we look to solutions for decarbonization, we should very much keep in mind solutions that will be lowest cost, easiest to implement, and also address the needs of those communities most expeditiously. Next slide. And we see the beginning of that happening in New York State through the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Preservation Act, but also through Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure investment plan. Hydrogen is featured relatively prominently there. The General Service Administration and Department of Energy have also entered significant discussions on how to incorporate hydrogen into their portfolio. And the power plant that Dr. Nelson mentioned earlier is a prime example of what's possible. But to really kind of drive that point home, that power plant is only going to be running with a mix of 30% renewables, with the balance being, 30% hydrogen with the balance being natural gas. The future we're hopeful to see is a future where we can have these power plants operating 100% on hydrogen. And why that's important will be clear when you look at this chart. This is from a recent NISO report documenting the current status of power generation in New York State. And as you can see, the orange areas of the chart, the biggest pie chart represents the whole state mix, and the smaller one to the right represents the downstate region. Though fossil fuel production represents 30% of the overall state mix, in reality, downstate, it's the lion's share of production. So when I look at this problem, I really do see an upstate and downstate divide. And when we think about the density of the population downstate and the populations that are surrounding these existing power plants, my immediate question is, how do we make sure these power plants are shut down? How do we make sure that they transition away from emitting criteria pollutants and CO2 and others towards zero emission, climate neutral energy production? And one possible pathway to that could potentially be hydrogen. Next slide, please. Now, we look at what New York's goals are, and we see that there's the meeting of the needs, but there's also a need for a reserve capacity. This is part and parcel with every ISO, RTO, and power plant, power generation and power management body out there. You design the grid not to meet what you need, but to meet all possible needs that are feasible. And in designing the grid and meeting the needs, there's clearly a recognition in New York State that we need a little bit more power than what is available within the state. When you look at this chart, you'll see that some of this reserve capacity is met by imports from other states. The key thing to take away from this is this must be dispatchable. This must be available on demand. This must be available as needed. And intermittent renewables currently are not able to do that. And for the foreseeable future are not able to do that alone unless they are paired with some sort of storage. Next slide, please. Now, in looking at the models, we see that 2030 becomes a threshold year for when things start to change in New York. According, again, to the New York ISO, at this point, there will be a need for increasing dispatchable resources. Battery storage at this point can still be utilized, and that's the existing chemistries that we all know and love. But beyond 2030, as we increase the amount of renewables penetrating the market, we're going to need additional storage capacity in some way, shape, or form. We're going to need to meet needs, both from an ancillary services perspective and a generation perspective, that, simply put, renewables will not be able to meet on their own. And when we think about what those potential options could look like, we have a myriad of options. Again, we could increase the renewable build out significantly above and beyond what is technically needed to meet our basic needs. We can increase the amount of battery storage, but at some point, increasing those needs becomes uneconomical. And we must ask ourselves, is there a better way? Is there a more efficient way? And most importantly, is there a more expeditious way to achieve immediate emissions reductions in the near term using existing assets that are available to New York? Next slide. The problem is compounded even further when you take into consideration the capabilities of the resources available. The chart on the left indicates hourly balancing, and with, again, batteries and load flexibility, we can meet those needs over an hourly intraday period. However, when we look at seasonal issues over a winter or maybe a cloudy summer, we come into an issue where the current future outlook for renewable energy growth and battery storage deployment simply will not be sufficient. And this is something NYSO has documented repeatedly in several reports, and I'm grateful that Mr. DeSocio is going right after me to reinforce hopefully some of these points. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at what the scope and magnitude of this could be, we see that, again, just like the current situation, we have a significant amount of generation downstate running from fossil fuels. As we transition towards a renewable future, the need for dispatchable emissions-free generation will be just as large in New York. Again, we see a need of roughly 50% of that unmet need from what the state plans to currently deploy. We'll need an additional 32 gigawatt hours of power to meet our power needs. Where will that come from? How will that be deployed? And that is the potentially $6 trillion question. Next slide, please. Now, clearly, when we think about the needs downstate, reliability concerns require that downstate New York have a certain degree of power production to meet a good chunk of its needs. But there are physical limitations. There's only so much that can be done. Yes, we are deploying significant amounts of offshore wind, which will certainly help go a long way. But there are a lot of concerns, environmental concerns, physical constraints, and other factors that need to be taken into account. And so when I think about what can be done with hydrogen, I see the existing assets that we have. I see what's happening with the existing coal plant on the West Coast. And I see the resources that are currently available in New York and the infrastructure at our disposal. And there is a possibility that hydrogen can play a role through the repurposing of existing resources towards meeting this dispatchable energy generation need that remains unmet through the state's plans. Next slide. And furthermore, it's not just the power, it's also ancillary services as well. These are the services that make the grid reliable and available to all customers, and essentially allows it to continue servicing all customers throughout the state and maintain the interconnects to other regions. Again, renewables, as they grow in significance, we're going to need to rely on more dispatchable resources to balance the system in a reasonable way to ensure continued reliability for the long term. So next slide. So when we look at what can be done and how it can be done, we look at some long-term, long-duration storage options, pumped hydro, unique battery chemistries that are being tested and deployed throughout the world at this moment, but also there's kinetic storage. But then again, the space constraint becomes an important consideration. Many of these long duration storage options require a significant amount of space, and they are not completely devoid of environmental concerns as well. Again, looking at hydrogen, we could reutilize existing infrastructure, but I also see the potential for cleaning the existing hydrogen industry. As Dr. Nelson mentioned before, most of the hydrogen produced today, what I'm referring to as blue hydrogen, I think she referred to it as gray hydrogen earlier in her presentation, that's produced from natural gas. As New York State builds out its renewable energy portfolio, we have the potential to use some of the excess energy that's produced and may not be needed at certain times to produce blue hydrogen through electrolysis and other processes that involve water, which becomes, again, a storable commodity, a tradable commodity, and something that will not degrade over time. So I see the potential for hydrogen to play a significant role in meeting New York State's goals. But I think what we need to do is analysis to understand what that pathway can look like, what it will cost, and how it will affect the very communities that we are trying to help and are in greatest needs of this change. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. And I'm going to pass it to Mike DeSocio from NYSO. Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank Sustainable Westchester and Michelle in particular for the invitation to participate in today's event. Looking very much forward to continuing the discussion that Rory just started and that Dr. Nelson also contributed to. I'm Mike DeSosi. I'm the Director of Market Design. I oversee the evolution of New York's wholesale market constructs, as well as research into integrating new types of technologies into the market. Next slide. So the New York ISO has several tenets of its mission. First and foremost is to deliver reliable electric power to all New Yorkers. And we do that in a cost-effective way using a set of wholesale markets, wholesale electricity markets that are bringing together buyers and sellers, and therefore achieving the lowest possible production cost of electricity in New York. Additional things that the ISO does help with, we do provide planning services and are assessing constantly the future of the grid. That's becoming even more in the space of everybody's thoughts, given the changes with CLCPA, and I'll talk more about that. And we also are advancing our infrastructure to make sure that we are using the best technologies possible. All of that together is really providing information to all New Yorkers and all stakeholders so they can make the best decisions for themselves, and do so under the context of achieving the lowest possible cost of reliable electric service. Next slide. Next slide. So you've seen this slide, this story in several different forms. This is the newest form from the New York ISO, and that's the policy timeline. And Rory touched on this a bit. And so this got New York ISO thinking about how do we make sure that we are prepared for the transition that is envisioned with the CLCPA. And then the chart on the right gives you a little sense of flavor as to how the energy future will change over the next 20 years. Next slide. And so the best way we know for trying to get our arms around what the future holds is to study it. We've spent a lot of time thinking through the challenges. We put forth a tremendous amount of information as to our current thinking to date, and that can be found in the links below. I'm not going to touch on this much here because I want to get to the meat of the presentation, which I think is trying to bring together what Dr. Nelson was talking about and what Rory was just talking about. So next slide, please. So we spent time in the 2018, 19, and 2020 timeframe thinking about how we could possibly get our arms around the transition that the grid is facing. And so what we ended up doing is working with some consultants and pulled together what we refer to as an economic expansion model. Now, the economic expansion model is very much focused on the electric sector and electric sector alone, but it does have in it the various targets that the CLCPA has created given the passing of the law in 2019. So here, what we're looking at is the general load pattern, load shapes that you see on the grid essentially today. This is how the grid operates today. You'll notice there's a tremendous amount of fossil, that's the orange natural gas. We have eliminated coal from New York, so that's good news. And we are starting to integrate other types of resources like onshore wind. And by 2024, we'd expect some offshore wind. There's a little bit of distributed solar. And in the base, you'll see hydro and nuclear. And hydro and nuclear have been clean resources in New York for many, many years, many decades. The other thing I'll point out on the bottom of the slide is that today, as Rory pointed out, there's a lot of supply, and a lot of that supply is clean upstate, and we are constrained in delivering that clean power into the downstate region of New York State. Next slide. So now we'll fast forward and we'll imagine it's 2030. Well, what will happen in the 2030 grid? As we start to see, we've started to build out much more wind. There's a lot more green on this slide. And you start to see some of the fossil not be used or potentially be reduced in nature. There's a lot more yellow and dark yellow, that's solar. And the load profiles start to change a little bit. You start to see in the summer time frame, the expectation is there'll be some more electric demands, primarily in the transportation and heating and cooling is causing that. And then in the winter, you're starting to see additional load being served, again, electrifying other sectors of New York State to help get New York State to its ultimate goal of 85% carbon-free economy by 2050. The other thing I'll point out here is there are times where we have more renewables than we can use, and there are still times where we don't have enough renewables to fulfill the actual consumption needs, electric consumption needs of New Yorkers. So you see in the summertime, July, we are still relying on gas pretty heavily, or some dispatchable non-renewable resource, and that is also true in the wintertime. The flows do start to change on us. In particular, we're starting to see that solar and offshore wind downstate is creating changes and shifts in how much energy and electricity we are shipping across the transmission system from upstate to downstate. And then the last thing, this is new on this slide, is we start to realize that as we get to 2030, we really need to tap into other options for establishing some flexibility on the system. So we start to believe that other areas, such as enabling demand side resources or tapping consumer habits and getting consumers more active in their electric consumption, becomes more and more important. And so you'll start to see us add this purple category called flexible load. Next slide. So now I've waved my magic wand and we've reached 2040. And here, what we start to see is we still have a problem. The problem is we have more renewables than we can possibly use in the shoulder seasons of New York's weather patterns. And then during the summer, we're still short of dispatchable resources we need to keep the lights on for consumers, for electric customers, both in the summer and the winter. And so we thought hard about what we could do here. In our model, we ended up modeling renewable natural gas. It does not need to be renewable natural gas. It's really just a proxy for some form of zero emission fuel. And really what it needs to be is some long duration fuel, something that can sustain several days or weeks of troughs. When you think about the fact that we will have periods where we have light winds, specifically when it's hottest, when it's most humid, we just don't get the wind penetration that we do on other parts of the year. And you start to see that in this model. So we modeled, really, we added to the model the idea that we could use the excess renewables to create some storage of electricity in different forms. And we chose a renewable gas form. It could be green hydrogen. It could be other types of fuel. And I want to state right here, the ISO is not, we're not really interested in what the exact technology is. What we're looking to find is a technology that can provide dispatchable electric service over many hours and many days of the year, potentially over spans of the year that span days and weeks of time. And if it's long duration storage, that sounds great if that's the cheapest option. If it happens to be green hydrogen, that's also fantastic. What we're really interested in is making sure we have the right resource set that achieves that lowest possible cost for New Yorkers, cleans up the environment as envisioned by the CLCPA, and helps us make sure that we keep the lights on. The other thing I'll point out on this slide is we are starting to really leverage the transmission system where there are times of the day where we are moving power from upstate to downstate, and then there's times of the day where we're actually moving power from downstate to upstate. And I can't overstate the real need and an essential service that the transmission grid will serve in this future. So why don't we move to the next slide? Next slide. So this is, kind of the current thinking the ISO has had on integrating renewables onto the transmission grid. And I want to point out a couple things here. We do think it's important that we take a measured approach to how we integrate renewables and build out strategic areas of the transmission grid to make sure we maximize the delivery of those renewables. So that to us makes a lot of sense. In particular, in downstate New York, the area that we worry about the most is the fact that we are so transmission limited between the Long Island transmission system and in New York City, Westchester transmission system. And so we do see a need to be able to tie all of that together and leverage this offshore wind build by establishing an offshore mesh network that we think would really help make sure we deliver those renewables to the electric loads that can use them the most effectively, whether that's delivering it to you and I so we can keep the lights on our homes, or delivering it to those processes that will create renewable gases like green hydrogen. If we can't deliver that wind to those facilities, we're going to end up spilling it, and that would be a shame. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm going to switch to Lydia Lee from Generate Capital. Lydia, it's yours.
Hi, everyone. Many thanks to Michel and Sustainable Westchester for the invite, and thank you all for joining me today. We're here to discuss how green hydrogen could contribute to our decarbonization initiatives. And next, please. Before we dig in, I'd like to introduce Generate Capital and how we work with our partners. Generate is a company that finances, builds, owns, and operates sustainable infrastructure projects. We were founded in 2014, mainly to fill in a capital gap between venture capitals who finance early stage technology development and traditional project financiers who typically have very low risk tolerance and only target utility scale solar and wind projects. We partner with leading project developers, utilities, and technology vendors. We deliver sustainable infrastructure characterized by what we call the 4Ds of the future. They're decentralized, democratized, digitized, and decarbonized. We currently have a lot of different projects in a variety of sectors across power, mobility, waste, and water. Right now, Generate operates about 2,000 distributed sustainable infrastructure assets. Many of those are actually in the state of New York, and we serve more than 1,000 customers, including companies, municipalities, school districts, and nonprofits. In New York State in particular, we're actively operating assets in community solar, fuel cells, rooftop solar, and waste management projects. So as an investor at Generate, I'm currently focused on the opportunities in the clean transportation vertical, which includes hydrogen and fuel cells. And we have already deployed over $200 million in fuel cells for both stationary and mobility applications. And Generate is currently seeking investments in green hydrogen, refueling infrastructure, vehicle fleet, and midstream projects. Next slide, please. So how does green hydrogen work? This may be a little bit repetitive of prior presentations, but I'd like to highlight the process again. Green hydrogen is produced by electrolyzing water using renewable energy sources, such as solar, wind, and hydropower. Particularly, hydrogen can be generated when there is abundant renewable sources and stored as liquid or gas. And that serves as a pretty unique type of long duration storage. Once the power is needed, then we can generate electricity using hydrogen fuel cells. This completes the cycle of green hydrogen production and usage with zero emission. Next slide. Yeah, so as we all know, green hydrogen production is not widely adopted today. And why is that? What are the challenges? In order to produce green hydrogen, the two largest cost components are electrolyzer equipment cost and renewable power cost. Electrolyzer equipment costs today basically range from $600 per kilowatt to $1,000 per kilowatt. And we believe that that has significant room to fall because manufacturing facilities are scaling up. As an example, now who is an established electrolyzer vendor, they announced a 10-fold expansion of their manufacturing capacity over the next couple years. And with the expansion, there will be significant cost improvement. The other component of green hydrogen cost is electricity, what we call the feedstock expense. This really varies geographically. And as we all know, the economics of powering electrolyzers with curtailed renewable energy is very attractive because you really are not paying for the electricity. But the key challenge of just doing that is the utilization rate of your electrolyzers tend to be pretty low because during a certain time of the day or certain time of the year, you will not be able to utilize electrolyzers. So now the question becomes, how do we balance the two large cost components and really be able to generate a large scale for a low cost? In the state of New York, even though renewable energy curtailment today is not as big of a problem as some other markets like California or Texas, we expect that this would require a better solution when a lot of the offshore wind is coming online. We already seen projects in California and Texas that are targeting large amount of curtailed energy, but what they basically do is that in addition to curtailed renewables, they also have a dedicated source of clean energy to support utilization during other time slots. So instead of just using curtailed renewables, we look at projects that have dedicated renewable power sources. Navigant Research actually analyzed 77 hydrogen projects that were announced over the past couple of years, and 25 of them have on-site wind and 17 of them have dedicated solar PV. So considering all these different aspects, based on the projections by Bloomberg, the cost of producing green hydrogen at large scale is expected to drop from about $6 to $7 per kilogram in 2019 to below $3 per kilogram in 2030. This would really allow us to expand the market and use green hydrogen in a lot of different applications. This cost expectation is also very consistent with what Dr. Nelson just provided as an example in a Utah project. Next slide. So the next topic I want to discuss today is, why is green hydrogen so important for all of the decarbonization initiatives? Hydrogen today represents a very large addressable market across power, transportation, and industrial applications. Many of these sectors are dirty and extremely hard to decarbonize just through electrification. Within the space that Navigant studied, there are 81 companies in the industrial gas, electrolyzer, and fuel cell segments, which already account for over 100 billion of revenue per year. The broader universe is even bigger and includes over 200 key players and represents over 5 trillion of revenue. Next slide. So if we look at the growth potential for green hydrogen, what can we really use it for? In addition to power generation or P2G, as we just discussed, there are opportunities for hydrogen to replace dirty fuel today in transportation, buildings, and industries. When we look at the scale of P2G projects, in 2014, a notable P2G project would be 1 megawatt system. In 2016, that increased to a 10 megawatt system. In 2018, we have seen the first 100 megawatt systems announced in the Netherlands and Germany. Since then, we have seen several large green hydrogen projects announced globally, including last year in 2020, Air Products actually announced a project in Saudi Arabia that is 4 gigawatts of renewable electricity for green hydrogen production. And that plant alone can produce about 650 tons of green hydrogen daily, which, to put in scale, that's enough hydrogen to run 20,000 hydrogen fuel cell buses. So overall, we really are expecting this market to grow and the different applications of green hydrogen to have significant impact across all these different industrial applications in the next decade. Next slide. And finally, I want to mention Plug Power as an example, just to put all these conceptual discussions in something that's very easy to understand and relevant today. As a quick disclaimer, I'd like to note that everything presented here is based on information that's already publicly available, and nothing discussed here should be viewed as investment advice. Plug Power is building the hydrogen economy as a leading provider of a comprehensive hydrogen and fuel cell solution in the US. So as a longstanding partner, Generate Capital have provided financing to support Plug's expansion in both hydrogen and fuel cell applications. Plug Power recently announced the plan to build the North America's largest green hydrogen production facility, and as we all know, this is going to be in New York. And we are expecting the plant to be about 120 megawatt of PEM electrolyzers produced by Plug Power. The facility will be utilizing hydropower in New York, which is completely green and emission-free. And the facility will be able to produce about 45 metric tons of green liquid hydrogen daily. That serves the Northeast region. And in addition to the New York production facility, Plug Power is also expected to expand from about 80 refueling stations today, dispensing 28 tons of hydrogen, to over 500 refueling stations, dispensing over 80 tons of hydrogen in 2024. Most of this is serving their customers who are using the hydrogen forklifts as a way of managing distribution centers. And Plug is also working on other on-road vehicle applications, which will also require refueling stations. So Generate and Plug, we do share a similar vision on building the hydrogen economy. And we are trying to find solutions to provide both economical and sustainable solutions to our customers. As other speakers have already mentioned today, we have to really work together to build a full ecosystem to scale green hydrogen. And we are actively seeking partnerships and opportunities to play a role in that ecosystem as a capital provider and with technical expertise. So please reach out to us if you want to connect. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions during our Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lydia, and appreciate that you guys worked out to be on time, which is a miracle in these presentations. And I will open the floor. Actually, I will open the floor to the chat. So we collected a few questions through the chat that I will share among the panelists. Well, we'll call them speakers here. It's in between Dr. Nelson, Lydia, Mike, and Rory. The first question I see is that if you were to convince a developer for renewable energy generation to consider hydrogen as a complement or a solution to their project, what kind of challenges and opportunities that you will speak about? And anyone can pick that up. And they have to unmute themselves. Any candidate for this?
Yeah, this is Laura. I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I appreciate, Lydia highlighting, what's happening with, the production of electrolyzers. And even though electrolyzers have been around for a long time, the scale up to really manufacture and produce those electrolyzers is challenging. And so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where, one, we've got to see the demand. So there's got to be the offtake that's going to support the investment. And so that's got to be key. And then once you can realize that, there is going to be some challenge with scaling up just in terms of, electrolytic production to provide that manufacturing capacity. So I think that one of the things we're going to see, and I hope that we see, is increased manufacturing even occurring in the U.S. and perhaps even locally. I'll say for the Utah project, we're hopeful that one of the things that can occur to even repurpose and kind of reutilize this very skilled workforce there is that we could see the manufacturing potential come along. So I think it's really, the offtake has got to be key. You've got to have those long-term contracts in place. Remember, those were super important for getting renewable energy. And we've got to see a pathway, I think, to really scaling the production of electrolyzers.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Anyone wants to chime?
Yeah, if I could just add on that, because we do require project developers to help us, develop and construct these projects. A lot of renewable energy developers who specialize in solar and wind, we would think that they can just add on hydrogen and hydrogen storage as part of the project, but it actually requires very different skill sets. The permitting process, the understanding of the technology, the process and operating expenses of adding that hydrogen component onto a renewable energy project is significantly different. So from a financier perspective, we typically want to work with developers who understand both the solar and wind aspect, but also have expertise on the hydrogen side. And that really narrows down that vertical a lot. Not many teams have the ability or experience to do that. So we also want to foster the whole ecosystem and allow people to gain that experience.
Yeah, well said, Lydia. And I'll add to that. I think, there's going to be the complexity of producing it, using it on site with a fuel cell. But there's also, the question of producing it and then transmitting it through whatever local gas distribution systems exist. I'm hesitant to recommend that as a path forward. I know from my work with other environmental groups, methane leakage is a major problem with existing gas infrastructure, and I'd be concerned of adding hydrogen to that. How much would actually make it in? Hydrogen being a much smaller molecule than methane. So I'd have some concerns with that. But to your point, the skill set is very different, and utilization of it does require much more consideration than what's normally required for renewable energy deployments. So lots of siting considerations, distribution considerations, and who the off-taker of the hydrogen is going to be are the biggest considerations I think need to be addressed.
I have a question for Mike DeSocio. Did NYSO ever consider a parallel distribution system for what is, say, renewable gas or green hydrogen? Is this the consideration?
That's a great question, Michelle. We did not consider an alternate transport mechanism, whether that be for electricity or for the gas itself. There is a tremendous amount of infrastructure that already exists. I couldn't imagine the cost of actually trying to build a parallel system to the existing system.
Thank you.
So no, we did not do that.
There's obviously, when folks think about storage, they think about lithium most of the time. Obviously, there's a major difference between green hydrogen storage and lithium storage. And, they both have their own characteristic parameters and processes. Can someone make sure that people understand, kind of educate the folks here that these could be complementary but not necessarily the same exact thing?
Michelle, I could try to take a stab at that, and if others have their views, please chime in. When the ISO thinks about lithium-ion technologies, we see that the capabilities of the technologies serve the daily needs pretty well. The fact that we can use the asset to discharge and potentially shift some of the higher load portions of the day to lower load portions of the day, and do that repeatedly day in and day out, that has some appeal, and the speed at which those resources can respond to a control action is very helpful for grid balancing. When we think about these other types of resources, we're more thinking about, we have a gap in energy capability that's going to span more than a portion of the day. Maybe it'll span 3/4 of the day to several days, possibly a week. And that's where we see the need for longer duration energy sources, such as a green hydrogen or long duration storage, where you can be generating that energy capability other times of the year and save it for use when you end up in those critical situations where you're just energy short. Maybe to say it a little more clearly, the lithium ion battery, if you had an 8-hour battery, it still takes upwards of 10 or so hours to charge it up fully if you fully depleted it. So when you start thinking about getting into 10-hour batteries, now you're getting really close to past the being able to charge and discharge that asset in one 24-hour cycle.
Thank you. There's one question that relates to certifying that we are dealing with green hydrogen. How we are going to certify that the source is green or renewable, and that green hydrogen. Anyone can take that on? Should I designate a victim?
Michelle, I'll try, and then others can chime in. That is a really hard question. And the reason it is really hard is that while the system has multiple sources of electricity, it's difficult to suggest that any electron that is being consumed came from a green resource or a gray or a brown resource. I think ultimately what you are focusing on is, how do you track that after the fact in some kind of accounting practice? You use RECs for that. You use other types of constructs to track the cleanliness of the electricity.
Thank you. Anyone wants to chime on this?
So I'd say it's probably similar to the process of how LCFS credits are rewarded in the state of California. For low carbon fuel standard, there are a lot of different pathways where you can achieve a certain level of CI score, carbon intensity score. And according to the score, you are rewarded either credits or you are punished for having to pay for credits. So that system really doesn't require people to be using exactly that electron or exactly the fuel that you generated, but you do have to demonstrate a complete pathway of the fuel that you are distributing. So with all the contracts and counterparties and agreements set in place, there is a way to prove you have contributed certain volume at a certain price per year to the overall system. And that's probably a much more feasible way of actually, tagging a particular molecule.
Right. And Dr. Nelson, you wanted to add something to this?
Well, I think Mike and Lydia have pretty well covered it. I would just add that, these protocols are under development. It's one of the policy recommendations that we at the Green Hydrogen Coalition make, that we really need to identify the compensation mechanisms and the tracking mechanisms. And Lydia brings up, the LCFS, which is, a good protocol that we could maybe adapt and consider. And it's certainly something that we're going to be looking at through the Western Green Hydrogen Initiative. And I think that there can be a national look at this as well, because, we're going to be dealing with, electrons, but we're also going to be dealing with other pathways of use of the green hydrogen molecule. So how we track and account for it, I think, is going to be in part a function of its end use.
There was a question regarding, we're looking at the electrolyzer cost coming down, but we are also interested in knowing about the fuel cell side, the cost and usage of the hydrogen. I guess maybe someone can answer here, or we can bring that down to the panels.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. So hydrogen fuel cells and electrolyzers, if you're thinking about, for example, PEM technology, they're basically reverse the chemistry with the same system. And so for Plug Power, for example, their manufacturing facility that is currently under expansion will be able to produce both the fuel cells as well as the electrolyzers using very similar engineering, obviously slightly different process. So I would assume that the same cost reduction that is available for electrolyzers would also be applicable to similar type of fuel cells.
One interesting question, what are you doing with the oxygen? That was a fun one. Can anyone pick that up?
Sell it. For air liquide, air products, these are industrial gas companies. Most of their hydrogen generation facilities, they sell the byproducts as well. But in other cases, depends on the delivery cost or offtake for oxygen, you may or may not need to sell it.
I feel we're getting to the point where it's the end of the Q&A here, unless among yourselves, I don't know if you wanted to like shoot you in between the speakers, any question that you feel you're interested in asking at this point of time. We're going to close in 5 minutes.
Michelle?
Hey, I just would like to.
Hold on a second, Warren.
I just wanted to say, thanks again, but I also wanted to say to Rory, our goal really is to see if we can get to 100% hydrogen combustion faster, sooner rather than later. So right on with you, 30% at IPP, you're right, day one, and how do we quickly get to 100%? And a lot of it is going to be addressing the challenges that have been mentioned here. It's going to be investment and driving that commercialization. So I think this has been just an incredible panel for how we look at what are those issues and how do we meet the demands for our transforming energy system. And absolutely, environmental justice has to be a fundamental part of what we're doing in that space too. So I just wanted to acknowledge that from Rory, because I think it's a really important point. It's going to take time, but let's see if we can do it faster.
Thank you very much. We're going to close the Q&A session. Warren, you wanted to say something directly, ask a question directly?
No, if that's allowed.
It will give that chance, Warren.
I saw Mike made a comment, and I guess one of the things that concerns me, and I know we touched on it in a couple of different places, is the infrastructure to actually pass hydrogen around. I know I heard 30% in the natural gas pipelines and stuff. I think the industry is maybe suggesting 15%. There's a lot of physics, just basic physics limits on a lot of this stuff. Fuel cells aren't terribly efficient. They're about maybe 60%. And, we're creating electricity and then driving fuel cells to do other things, I guess. I'm just wondering from a physics point of view, Mike, you mentioned that we weren't looking at things like hydrogen pipelines. And I know hydrogen has its own problems with eroding steel and stuff like that, certain types of steel. Are there things that we're doing beyond just the current things that we heard about to basically give us the ability to move this stuff around the country so that you can actually use it in cars and other things? What I heard from knowing some of the physics, what I heard didn't really give me a good feeling that we can figure that out very easily.
Maybe I can just jump in super quick. I mean,
in 2 minutes.
We have over 700 miles of hydrogen pipelines already in Texas and in the Gulf region. In LA, they have 15 or 16 miles, I think, available. And it is going to be a big investment to look at new infrastructure, but I think it's possible, and they're definitely doing it in Europe. It really comes from that policy and that political commitment. So I think that has to be a priority. So I think it was a great question and a very important point, because we need to be able to move it to use it. Thank
you very much, Dr. Nelson. Thank you very much to the speakers for coming in. And and really create a very, very lively conversation here. We're going to switch to a panel, and we are going to introduce Bill Acker, our partner. Bill is CEO of New York Best, and he is going to be moderating the panel here. And I hope that all the panelists are coming online, that they're online, right? And we're going to start by having Bill introducing himself, and then we'll switch to Steve Szymanski from NEF. Bill?
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Acker. I'm the Executive Director of the New York Battery and Energy Storage Technology Consortium. New York Best is a nonprofit organization advancing the energy storage sector in New York State. And when we say energy storage, we use a very large definition of energy storage. And we have from the beginning. We're now just over 10 years old. And from the inception, the name was picked to indicate batteries and other forms of energy storage, including hydrogen and fuel cells that we're talking about here today. We have about 180 member companies, mostly companies, some universities and national labs in our organization. And we do a lot of work in order to advance the policy and open the markets, removing market barriers, like we've heard some about with siting and interconnect and permitting, and also the market rules in New York State. We also do a lot of work to advance commercialization, bringing companies together, creating relationships, and helping companies commercialize. We have a testing laboratory in Rochester, New York, operated for us by DNVGL, and do a lot of work in bringing companies' technology forward and making sure that it's properly evaluated and has traction in the marketplace. So with that said, I guess one last piece on New York Best is we run a number of conferences each year, and we have our main conference each year we call Capture the Energy, and that's going to be occurring on June 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of this year. It's a virtual conference this year again, and then we'll have a live conference in the fall. So we'd encourage you to check that out. With that introduction, I'm delighted to be here today and to partner, and I compliment Michelle and Sustainable Westchester on really doing a really nice job pulling this together. We're now going to move to our speakers. The way we're going to do this is each speaker is going to have about 5 minutes, give us an introduction and an overview, and then we're going to have a moderated panel discussion. So I'll now turn it over to Steve Szymanski from NEL to give his presentation. Take it away, Steve.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to Sustainable Westchester and to Michelle for pulling this together. I will say that I did participate in the first workshop we did in White Plains in December of 2019, and I really miss kind of having everyone together so that we can kind of interact a little more easily. But I do really appreciate that this is. This is a well done format, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate. Next slide, Michelle. So just a few quick comments on NEL Hydrogen. We have a vision as a pure play hydrogen company of really empowering generations with clean energy forever. I mean, we talk a lot about kind of industrial applications for hydrogen and kind of commodity applications for hydrogen, but really the core vision of the company is really centered around the application of hydrogen to enable clean energy. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about green hydrogen. Next slide, Michelle. Just a few, kind of factoids about NEL Hydrogen. We are a public company traded on the Oslo Stock Exchange, and it's really sort of amazing that a company with just a few hundred employees worldwide, could be so well capitalized. I mean, our market cap is over $4 billion. Which is pretty extraordinary, kind of considering, we've only been a public company for a few years. But we're a global company. We have manufacturing in Norway, Denmark, and the US. I work for the Electrolyzer division, and I'll kind of show you how we kind of split up. But I am based at the US subsidiary where we manufacture PEM electrolyzers in Wallingford, Connecticut. And, between our two electrolyzer business units, we've installed over 3,500 electrolyzers worldwide. So this is a very mature industry, and electrolyzer equipment is really well kind of represented in the commercial world. We also do hydrogen fueling stations. I'm not going to talk so much about that because really the focus here is kind of green hydrogen and how electrolyzers kind of enable that that application. Next slide, Michelle. So again, we kind of split the company into kind of our electrolyzer division and our fueling station division, and I'll just say that at Nel, we're a little bit unique in that we offer both, alkaline electrolyzer technology as well as PEM electrolyzer technology. I'm not going to get so much into the differences between the two technologies, but having both kind of gives us, we feel some added value because we're able to kind of approach each project in a technology neutral way, and kind of figure out what's the best solution for the customer. Next slide, Michelle. So I just wanted to kind of highlight kind of the manufacturing centers, because when we talk about capacity, it's very important to kind of understand kind of where electrolyzer companies really are. Now, at the PEM electrolyzer division in the US, we have a manufacturing capacity of about 50 megawatts per year, and that's, I'll say, in a one shift operation. So we believe that with the current factory that we have in Wallingford, we could probably do about 100 megawatts of PEM electrolyzer capacity. For alkaline electrolyzers, this is where the capacity is really kind of being built ahead, and by that I mean we're undergoing a factory expansion in our factory in Haroya. By the end of this year, we'll be at about 500 megawatts of production capacity per year, and we have a build out plan in that same facility to get to over 2 gigawatts per year of production capacity. So, nobody has built a 100 megawatt plus scale project since we did it in the first half of the 20th century. But there's enough confidence in these emerging markets and the demand for the technology that we are going ahead and building capacity to be able to address that. And I think most commercial electrolyzer companies are doing the same thing. Next slide, Michelle. So $1.50 a kilogram is something that we announced at our Capital Markets Day a couple months ago. And that is I think, for many people, they would say, $1.50 by 2025 is might not be realistic, but we have a very specific pathway to achieving it. You can see some of the assumptions in the fine print underneath. I won't get into the details on those, but $1.50 a kilogram by 2025 really will be an enabler for green hydrogen. And I have a couple slides to address that. Next slide, Michelle. So, when we look at, what are the things that are going to enable $1.50 per kilogram hydrogen, just this waterfall chart kind of shows just a few of the contributors. First, the expansion of the factory in Haroya, that's a big step right there. I mean, being able to increase our capacity, introduce advanced manufacturing techniques, mass production techniques. I think somebody in the previous discussion kind of mentioned how PEM electrolyzers and PEM fuel cells can kind of share in kind of cost reduction opportunities because of the similarity. Well, I mean, that's also true of electrode fabrication for alkaline electrolyzers. And so that expansion, doing more automation, less kind of batch processing, less touch labor, that's going to drive a significant amount of cost out of the electrode manufacturing. And then there's this big, EPC piece. I mean, one of the things I tell people, when I first got into the electrolyzer business over 20 years ago, I used to tell people I was in the hydrogen appliance business, because that's kind of like, what we were doing back then. We were manufacturing relatively small systems, literally plug and play. These were literally things like, hydrogen generation appliances. But today's larger green hydrogen projects that we're talking about really are design build projects. And so, there's this significant EPC component. And so one of the things that we're doing is kind of standardizing designs that will enable us to reduce kind of the engineering scope for these plants. Procurement, by standardizing components and kind of subsystems, we're going to be able to take cost out because we're able to kind of develop a supply chain, and we're able to kind of produce these things in a much more efficient way. And, on the construction side, again, by having kind of standardized designs, prefabricated skids, pre-integrated subsystems, that will reduce the installation and commissioning efforts on site. And so when you kind of, add all these contributors up, going to, a 75% cost reduction, which is the kind of thing we're talking about, really is quite possible. We have a very specific, detailed pathway for actually achieving this. Next slide, Michelle. I think this is my last slide, just kind of discussing kind of, electrolyzer capex. And, this is actually an IEA, kind of chart. And on the left is your alkaline electrolyzer capex on a $ per kilowatt scale. And, you can see that, at the mid-level of the band, we're already at, below $1,000 a kilowatt for alkaline electrolyzers. Okay. And then on the PEM side, we're starting from a higher point, nominally you could say for a 1 megawatt system today, we might be closer to $1,500 a kilowatt. As PEM systems also get larger and we take advantage of the same kinds of economies of scale and standardization, things like that, those costs are going down as well. And to show kind of the convergence on the right, you can see the dotted line is kind of the lower end of the band on the alkaline capital cost, and how the PEM cost is really converging towards the alkaline cost. So we really do see alkaline and PEM kind of converging in the long term. And, I think that, we have a very specific pathway for achieving that for both technologies. And I think that's my last slide. I'm sorry, I do have one more. So basically this just kind of shows how we see the cost of green hydrogen comparing to gray and blue hydrogen on this chart. So the gray bar at the bottom, that's basically your gray hydrogen, and that's hydrogen from fossil fuels, both both from natural gas and coal. And then you can see our 2025 target at $1.50 a kilogram. So we feel that we can compete with gray hydrogen by 2025 through the kind of pathway we're talking about. Now, blue hydrogen is shown as the band above that. And again, that's fossil fuel derived hydrogen with CO2 capture. And then you could see kind of how green hydrogen in the purple bars kind of works downward And again, this is from kind of IEA sources and other kind of industry sources. But again, what I'm trying to do is juxtapose what we see the target, the 2025 target, as relative to where some other folks are seeing it. And we believe we can compete with gray hydrogen, beyond 2025 based on our cost pathway. And I believe that is it this time.
Very good. Thank
Great.
you, Steve.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we're now going to move right into Michael Ducker's presentation from Mitsubishi Power. So go ahead, Michael.
Great, thanks. And thanks for having me here today. So if we go to the next slide here, want to just give a quick background on Mitsubishi Power for those who aren't familiar with us, and kick off with our mission statement, because at the end of the day, everything we're doing right now around our product lineup and really our solutions approach is in support of this mission statement, which is to provide power generation and storage solutions to our customers, ultimately empowering them to affordably and reliably combat climate change. And that's such an important part too of today, because no matter whether it's the end user, the investment community, state utilities, whomever else, the challenge that we have today is looking at solving the issue of climate change, but again, doing so affordably and reliably. And this is where, as we look at the solutions and what we're offering today, particularly the opportunity for hydrogen, really plays a very important role in that. And so on the next slide, I'm going to talk a lot about too, because I'm seeing even a lot of the comments in the chat box talking about round trip efficiencies and the cost of hydrogen and some of the complexities we have. The problem, and again, I'm focused right now on the power industry. And so first and foremost, what I'll say is anybody that asks me, what's the dollar per kilogram cost of green hydrogen for power? I immediately ask them, what's the dollar per kilogram cost of lithium-ion batteries? The reason I ask that question is to make a point, is that with batteries, we truly see them as a storage medium. And so we don't think of it as a fuel. And so this whole comparison of hydrogen dollar per kilogram in the power industry to natural gas and other forms, it's really not the right question to be asking. The question we need to be asking is, by integrating hydrogen, other storage technologies, how do we more cost effectively integrate renewables and again, able to solve our climate goals that we have over the next decade to 2 decades. And so in saying that, if we look at these charts here, it's really helpful to understand the opportunity and the need for storage. On the left, what we see here is year-on-year curtailments of wind and solar capacity in California through 2021. And what you'll notice is that each color chart, effectively year-on-year, we continue to have record curtailments of renewables. But more importantly, what we're starting to see as we get to 30% and beyond renewable penetration, we start to see a seasonal impact of when those renewables are being curtailed. And so in last year alone, what we saw was roughly about 200 gigawatt hours per month of curtailments of renewables. Again, this is effectively cost-free and carbon-free energy that's being produced at times that the grid just cannot handle it. Conversely, in August of last year, we had the first rolling blackouts in California in over 2 decades. And so the question starts to become less of the duck curve and how do I support that intraday energy imbalances of renewables, more towards how do I take excess that typically occurs in certain times of year, particularly the late winter, spring months, and shift it to times of deficit. And that graph on the right really captures this. And this is a simulation in CalISO that looked at if we had 100% renewables, what would that grid look like without any energy storage or anything else? And this really highlights the fact that we're moving away from that duck curve and that intraday imbalance and moving more towards the seasonal shifting of energy from periods of oversupply to periods of undersupply. And so on the next slide, this is where hydrogen starts to take shape in the role it has. Oh, sorry, slide 80, please. And when we think about the power industry, really hydrogen serving as an energy storage asset, we compare that to batteries. And really any energy storage system, there's 3 fundamental components of it. You need a means to control the rate of charge of taking excess electricity and converting it to a form of storable energy. You then need a means to store that energy. And then you need a means to convert that stored chemical energy back to usable electrical. And for batteries, we have a rectifier that controls the charging rate, lithium-ion cells that control how much energy is stored, and ultimately an inverter convert that DC back to AC electricity. For hydrogen, it's the exact same ecosystem in the fact, though, that we've got now an electrolyzer that takes excess electricity, converts it with water to a form of storable energy and hydrogen. That hydrogen can be stored in salt caverns, pipelines, or above ground pressure vessels. And then ultimately we can use a gas turbine that can take that stored chemical energy, convert it back to usable electrical. But the most important part in all of this is everyone likes to try to compete each of these technologies. And the fact of the matter is, these are two very different use cases. Both hydrogen as a long duration energy storage resource, as well as lithium-ion batteries as a short duration energy resource, are going to be critical technologies to support the more affordable, reliable integration of renewables to ultimately achieve our climate goals. And we don't have time today, but we've run a lot of simulations. I think we saw it with, what we saw there with New York ISO, we've seen with Cal ISO, we've done it ourselves, that show it's less about looking at the individual asset costs, as opposed to on a system-wide basis, how do I get the lowest production cost, lowest system cost, reduce overbuilds, reduce curtailments, reduce inefficiencies on the system, and by bringing both hydrogen and batteries that can really help solve that issue. And so I point this out because then on the next slide, Dr. Nelson already highlighted to a good degree these projects, but really these are the first projects in the world that are looking to start employing this business model, this approach of hydrogen as a long duration energy storage resource. And those two projects are the Intermountain Power project, which again, Dr. Nelson already went through most of the details of that one. The only thing I add is that those are Mitsubishi Power hydrogen capable gas turbines, which out of the gate will operate on a blend of 30% hydrogen and 70% natural gas, which keep in mind, that's less of a technology consideration. That's more actually of a market consideration. There just isn't enough renewables quite today that we need to get to 100%. But in every market in the United States, we're starting to see that need to cost effectively transition these assets over time from gas generators to really 100% hydrogen energy storage assets. And then adjacent to that site, we have our Advanced Clean Energy Storage Project, which is the world's largest renewable energy storage project, where we're utilizing the salt caverns that we have in Delta, Utah, to store green hydrogen that not only can serve the power industry, but also other verticals looking to decarbonize, like heavy haul transport and heavy industrial sectors. The factoid I'll throw out on each of these salt caverns is they can store upwards of 150 gigawatt hours worth of dispatchable energy. So the entire United States right now has roughly over 1 gigawatt hour of lithium-ion batteries installed across the entire nation. And so in each one of these salt caverns, you can store about 150 times the entire installed base of batteries in the US. And in this formation alone over in the West, we have about 100 cavern capability. And so when we think about large scale energy storage, that's where the role of hydrogen really can come into play. On the next slide, just going back to the gas turbine piece and how are we able to achieve this, really one of the fundamental design philosophies that we've taken at Mitsubishi on the gas turbine piece is trying to avoid rework, trying to avoid, having to come in and retrofit plants with extensive amount of hardware. How do we make the most minimal amount of changes to that infrastructure to support, again, cost-effective integration of hydrogen over time? And right now, really the only major component that we need to change in the gas turbine itself is the combustion system to be able to go up to 100% hydrogen. Going on the next slide, just to make sure we continue with this trend, as Steve was talking about, the electrolysis industry is very well mature, commercially mature. It's now just first of a kind market applications. The same goes for hydrogen use in gas turbines. We've been running hydrogen in gas turbines for decades, actually back to the 1970s. We've already hit 100% hydrogen capability on different combustion systems. Really what's changed today is the market application and need, particularly looking at using today's latest advanced class gas turbines, which can achieve ultra low NOx of down around 2 ppm at the stack. And so just showing on here right now, we've already achieved 30% hydrogen mix with our existing gas turbines that are out there that use these latest advanced class, what's known as pre-mixed dry low NOx combustion systems. By 2025, all our validations will be complete for our latest combustion systems that will be able to run on 100% hydrogen. And so it's not just the Intermountain Power Plant. We also had Capital Power. We've got about a dozen different customers today that are also signed up or in the process of signing up for this 100% hydrogen capability. And all of it is really this transitory approach of how do I get steel in the ground today to meet my resource needs? but also recognizing that steel in the ground today, how it's used is going to fundamentally change over the next 2-3 decades. And I want to make sure that I can change with markets and as more renewables come online. And that's really the value of hydrogen. And the last slide, just in closing here, is understanding that Mitsubishi really has been moving, as I said, beyond just a technology provider, more from a solution standpoint. And this is where we created our Hydaptive package. And the Hydaptive really is looking at integrating both the hydrogen production and the hydrogen utilization and hydrogen storage all in one site. And really, particularly for the grid operators and other entities out there, at the end of the day, this looks like a giant battery in an extremely flexible energy storage system, such that when we look at periods of oversupply, I can be running the electrolysis, turning down the gas turbines, and be able to create a huge swing on the system to support oversupply events. At the same token, instantly, if we have an undersupply event, I can shut down the electrolyzers, I can bring up the gas turbines, ramp those very quickly, and we can support huge swings then on ramp the other way. Additionally, the gas turbines are providing very critical support like inertia, response, primary, secondary frequency response, et cetera. And so in a grid of the future where we have that need for these types of services, this is part of the value that integrating these systems can really bring to the table. So with that, very much look forward to the rest of the panel and the conversations, questions hereafter.
Thanks, Michael. We'll now move into Philippe Barbert from Plug Power to give our next presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Michel. If you can move to the next one, Michel. So really what I wanted to say is that Plug Power, we've been trying to be the global leader in hydrogen fuel cells. We started over 20 years ago, focusing primarily on fuel cell systems. And to date, we've deployed now over 60,000 of them. But lately, in the last few years, we've also expanded our focus to also include hydrogen generation, hydrogen liquefaction, and hydrogen refueling system as well. So we've got now over 135 refueling stations across the world, which makes us really a different approach than other hydrogen providers in the sense that we are fully vertically integrated. We can provide a full suite of products from hydrogen generation all the way to the fuel cells and aftermarket support. We are also the largest consumer of liquid hydrogen right now, with 30 tons of hydrogen daily use. I think we're actually more like 40 these days, and with 1,000 employees. Even though we're a global company, and we can move to the next slide, Michel, we really are New Yorkers at heart. Our head office is in Latham, New York, Albany. And we've got a gigafactory going live in Rochester, New York, where we'll be making our own MEAs. We are currently the largest North American supplier of MEAs, and we expect to be the largest MEA supplier globally within the next 18 months. These MEAs go into two aspects. The first one is our fuel cells, which you should be quite familiar with, and also our new line of electrolyzers, which we will be using to make green liquid hydrogen, with our first plant announced in New York in the Buffalo area, going live in probably end of 2022, early 2023. So, and this is really the new approach that Plug Power is taking. We are focusing exclusively on green hydrogen, green liquid hydrogen at that, as a medium for hydrogen in the United States. The plant in Buffalo will be a 45-ton with room for expansion, and it will be supplying our customers, whether they be industrial or whether they be in mobility or e-commerce. We had established customers in New York, such as Amazon, Walmart, and Cisco. So they will be supplementing our operation. Next slide, please. So focusing a little bit on the New York plan that we've announced, it's going to be provided from hydropower, so we will completely decarbonize. We will be liquefying it for storage and distribution, and then using it at our point of use. Something also is that to ensure that we have a completely decarbonized wheels to well, we will also be using zero emission Class 8 vehicles to deliver said fuel using our own Plug Power fuel cells. So we are really looking to have a net zero emission at the point of use for hydrogen. And last slide. Since this was about mostly hydrogen storage, I kind of decided to put a bit of a layout of our upcoming plant. I want to thank Mitsubishi for not making me a little bit self-conscious about my drawings. It's not as polished as theirs, but I thought it was interesting because we do have a couple of options for storage. So from the electrolyzers, we will have bulk low pressure gaseous storage, which on the price per kilogram becomes quite interesting. We will also be liquefying our hydrogen afterwards and storing into bulk cryogenic spheres. which will give us plenty of buffer and storage for potential outages or force majeure. And then from there, we will be transferring it to our customer location using over-the-road assets, cryogenic tankers per se. And it's not shown on this one, but we also have capabilities for high pressure storage as well, at the point of use especially for mobility, where we need high pressure to refill mobility vehicles. So this is what I had prepared for you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Philippe. We're now going to go over to Trevor Brown from the Ammonia Energy Association.
Hi, thank you. This has been really interesting day so far today. If you can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about something that's not hydrogen, or at least I am going to talk about hydrogen, but I'm going to use the word ammonia. So ammonia is, just to ground the people who aren't familiar already, ammonia is a chemical with the NH3, so 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Very, very simply, it's a liquid where hydrogen is a gas, and so those 3 hydrogens in the molecule mean that there's volumetrically more hydrogen in ammonia than there is in hydrogen. And so ammonia as a way of moving hydrogen molecules around is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about ammonia as a competitor to hydrogen, but ammonia as I've called this presentation, a pathway to market. A pathway to market for hydrogen, and also a pathway to market for renewables. We've talked a lot about, we've used the word constrained, talking about renewables quite a lot already today. And my sort of frame of reference is let's get away from those constraints. Let's make some molecules with all of that constrained electricity. Next slide. So the Ammonia Energy Association has been around since 2004. Previously a fairly academic group. We relaunched in 2018 when these ideas were becoming quite commercial, where the renewables and the hydrogen and the ammonia arguments were becoming ready for being properly developed. We're taking on 2 sides of the ideas. First, we need to be decarbonizing ammonia production. We currently make 180 million tons per year of ammonia around the world. You mainly know it because of fertilizer. Roughly 50% of the nitrogen atoms in your body were made in a Haber-Bosch factory. And so this is not a demand that's going to go away. Currently, ammonia consumes roughly half the world's hydrogen production. So if we can substitute hydrogen from non-sustainable sources with hydrogen from sustainable sources, that is a great outcome. But if we could do that, then we'd have a nice dense molecule that we could also use in energy markets. And so we talk about where that can be adopted. And our association helps to sort of connect those value chains, enabling in renewables and hydrogen to scale up massively. And the members of the association, if you can skip to the next slide, are what bridges the gaps. They're cross-sector, connecting the fertilizer people with the electricity people, with the hydrogen people, and they're international, connecting all the different continents so that we can move through this energy transition as quickly as possible. If we can move to the next slide. I'm going to talk about 3 use cases because I've only got a couple of minutes and I just want to sort of throw a bunch of ideas for our discussion. So use case number 1 is maritime fuel. Here we have an industry that's a huge sector of the global emissions, promising to decarbonize, and it has a roadmap to do so. And to be appropriately on that roadmap, here's an S-curve that the COP26 climate champions and the Global Maritime Forum put out last month. If we have an S-curve and we hit 5% zero carbon fuel penetration by 2030, that's where we need to be in order to be on trajectory. That is 60 gigawatts of operational electrolyzers in 9 years from today. That would produce roughly 30 million tons of green ammonia or hydrogen equivalent. And that's where we need to be by 2030. What's very important to understand about this as a use case is this isn't a abstract theory. This is businesses that have a problem for which zero carbon fuels represent a solution. And that's something we haven't had very much in the sort of renewables and the hydrogen debate. We've got a lot of things that are driven by government regulations, but rarely have we had really a demand for vast quantities of decarbonized fuel. And we have that now in the maritime sector. Of course, if you look at the longer term scenarios out to 2050 and you start saying, well, if we're really decarbonizing, what is that? A terawatt of installed electrolyzer capacity just to serve the maritime sector. Next slide. If we're looking at the power sector, now by power, what I'm really talking about is peaking plants. So what replaces the natural gas in our future decarbonized electric grid. And I'm taking this down into a very specific example, which is the Japanese roadmap for fuel ammonia, which was published in February this year. They are going to be combusting ammonia in coal power plants at a 20% co-combustion rate. So 20% by energy content, that's roughly 500,000 tons of low carbon ammonia per year in a gigawatt power plant. That first conversion is going to be taking place in the next 18 months. And by 2030, they expect to have 6 of those power plants operating. The trajectory, and I noticed Michael didn't mention it, but Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' new 40 megawatt ammonia gas turbine is part of the next step of their trajectory, which is that we move to an ammonia gas turbine technology. Their plan is to have a 30 million ton consumption powering a completely decarbonized Japanese power grid by 2050. And the Japanese energy trading companies and exporting those technologies in the region to create a 100 million ton per year regional low carbon ammonia demand for the power sector. And if you move to the next slide. One of the previous speakers mentioned the Saudi Arabia project that is a $5 billion 4 gigawatt project in a city of the future that they've not built yet called Neom. And this is an ammonia plant. This is a 1.2 million ton per year ammonia plant that Air Products is going to be taking the offtake, exporting it into where there is hydrogen demand, and then cracking it back to splitting the nitrogen and the hydrogen molecule back into pure hydrogen for use in fuel cell trucks. And I wish I'd thrown in another slide that illustrated some of the other very, very large scale projects that go alongside NEOM. There's the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is 6,500 square kilometer wind and solar farm in the Pilbara in Western Australia. That's a 26 gigawatt project that they intend to start constructing later this decade. And there's many others. These are being announced. You know, there's another gigawatt scale green ammonia project being announced every couple of weeks at this point. So if you move on to the final slide, I just wanted to sort of wrap up with some sort of questions and conversation starters. So to what extent is ammonia as a hydrogen carrier being considered when people talk about hydrogen in an energy system? To what extent are ammonia fuel cells part of the portfolio under examination, and ammonia turbines? What scale does your project have to be for ammonia to be a more cost-effective solution than hydrogen? There is a scale, but where is it? What's the tipping point where your project is going to be better served by using pure hydrogen versus pure ammonia? And if we were connecting 60 gigawatt installed capacity of electrolyzers in the maritime market into additional kind of scale of capacity in a power market, plus all of the generation that we're going to require to serve the hydrogen market, not to mention decarbonizing fertilizers, and you start combining these different capacities into a system. How does that whole system design or imports between sectors and sector coupling impact the way we approach these questions? And my final thing I just want to say is certification is a huge topic. We do need to go beyond colors, and we need to be talking about carbon intensity, whether it's from renewables or from fossils. I'll just, for example, your methane pyrolysis technology is going to have a very, very low carbon footprint, but it's not going to be green. At what point do you want to restrict the technology ability to be able to diversify? Which is why, in addition to carbon intensity, recognition of a production pathway in your core certification is going to be extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Trevor. And our final speaker today is Olivia Marche from ENGIE. So please take it away.
Thanks, Michel, to invite me to this panel. Very proud also to share views and vision about main challenges and experience we are facing right now on the development on our projects. You can go to the next slides, please. So you may know about ENGIE. We are a worldwide company, energy utility. We have three main objectives. The first one is to develop a renewable, to be well placed in the infrastructure, and to develop also energy services. Our main purpose is to accelerate the energy transition toward carbon neutral economy. And by pushing services, infrastructure, but also global solutions. And today it's more than 170 people that are working towards this target. You can go to the next slide. Let's speak about hydrogen. I think we all share this view, the fact that hydrogen will be part of this green energy mix. And at ENGIE, we do believe that this energy vector will balance some part of the world that will be in lack of renewable and some part that will be in excess of renewable energy. And this hydrogen will be able to balance, in fact, the globality of the world. And so at ENGIE, we are deeply convinced that to develop this vision, we need first to develop large-scale installation by focusing on some specific areas with specific segments. Then to develop local hubs or cluster around this development, and then to enlarge this vision and to connect the different countries' hubs together. And today it will be able due to the large transportation of hydrogen that are under development. And we could have a discussion on it with different projects that are pushing today at worldwide level. So this vision, has been built 5 years ago. And at that time, lots of people were looking at ENGIE as it's not possible, what's this, and so on. And today it's a reality. It is shared by different companies and different associations. And at ENGIE, we are implementing this vision on real case development. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to give you some figures about the project that we are running today, more than 40 projects are in the portfolio from different stages of development, from the inception, so the beginning of the project, to the execution of some of it. So we are targeting first the industry because we want to have the scale of the project to ensure the cost decrease of the production. And then we address other usage around this main off-takers. The main sectors that we are looking at right now is the traditional sector that are using hydrogen. So it's, for example, ammonia, refinery, cement, for example. but also we are developing new usages. New usages are, for example, the development we are pushing in mines, but also for heavy mobility usage, such as trains. You can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, here is, you see all the projects. So anytime and you see the project first are developed with large scale of taker, and then we ensure the development by developing the infrastructure around the project, mainly by leveraging on existing infrastructure such as pipes, CCGT, for example, or LNG terminals. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to explain one case we are developing right now. You may have heard about it. It's a case that we are developing with Total. It's a case based in the south of France called Massilia. This is a typical new type of project that are you can see in the development worldwide. It's a 100% green hydrogen project with dedicated development of a farm, a PV farm, electrolyzer, and its storage. The beauty of this project is not only that we are 100 green hydrogen, but also the fact that we are coupled to an existing installation. It's a biorefinery. So we need to integrate, this large-scale installation in the existing installation. So we are facing some cases, safety issues, permitting issues, acceptability issues, and so on. The project is based on a 40 megawatt electrolyzer, which is coupled to a 100 megawatt PV farm and a storage about 12 tons. And we will ensure the production of about 5 tons a day for this biorefinery. And so the objective is, to have a green hydrogen and to shift from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen in the production of a biofuel. On this project, we are pushing, in fact, different innovation. The main one is the energy management system. So we will develop a specific tools that are able to pilot the production of the farm, the production of the hydrogen, and the storage to supply the biorefinery. We will have also the traceability of these green electrons to this green hydrogen. Second development will be the storage. We have a quite large scale storage, even if it's not an underground storage, and we have a discussion previously on this underground storage. It's a surface storage, about 12 tons, but it's quite a large installation for this type of site, Seveso sites. The third development in terms of innovation is about safety. We will develop specific models to ensure, the simulation about safety issues, mainly when you are in some specific conditions. Today, 2D models are not sufficient accurate to have this to simulate these issues. And the last point is we will have a direct connection to some PV farm to the electrolyzer. So this development will enable us to decrease, to ensure higher efficiency on the equipments, and also to lower the cost of the equipments. So here is, you see, a kind of development that we are pushing at ENGIE. So this is a first step of a development that will be larger. As I mentioned previously, we anchor a project and then we scale up the project. The objective on this project is to have about 200 megawatts electrolyzer set up in the area and to address other usages. Other usages will be here refinery, but also mobility for maritime application, but also for heavy mobility. Just to give you figures on this type of development, we are in the feasibility phase. more than 40 people are working on this development. And you need very specific competencies to ensure the development and to de-risk the project to have it on time. The objective is to produce the first molecule of hydrogen in 2024, having all the permit issues solved and all the business model and so on also set up. If you can go to the next slide. So when you want to develop today a green hydrogen project, in fact, you are facing a major issue, which is the competitiveness of your solution. You know that green hydrogen is more expensive than gray hydrogen. And so to fill the gap, in fact, at ENGIE, we activate 5 main levers. The first one is about performance and capex. So performance and capex is to decrease the cost of the main brick, which is the electrolyzer. And we have a presentation previously that show how you can do it. You need to standardize the brick, but also you need to work on the performance and the durability of your equipment to be at the rendezvous in terms of efficiency, for example. But it's also a question of integration between bricks, meaning that you need to integrate the storage, the electrolyzer, but also the PV, and to have the best design of this key component to have the best price. In terms of energy management, the issue is to manage the electricity. You know that to produce green hydrogen, roughly 60% to 70% is the cost of the electricity. Operating an electrolyzer means that you have a certain flexibility. So how you ensure the best electricity price, the best profile, to have this best price of production of hydrogen. So it's managing PPAs, so long-term contracts, but also the profile of this electricity with the reaction of your electrolyzer. The third point is the ecosystem. The ecosystem is, in fact, ensuring the development of hydrogen for industry, but it's also working with the surrounding. And anytime you develop a project, you not only discuss with your main customer, but also with all the partners, all the potential partners to develop this ecosystem. The fourth point is the added value. Added value is what you can bring today with green hydrogen. So when you back your green hydrogen with PPAs, with long-term PPAs or specific development of renewable, that's the case, for example, for Total, you can ensure a long-term vision on your price of hydrogen. So this is a value for your project. You have also other value, the fact that it's 100% green. And you know that we are working, for example, with some green fertilizer, and we are working to show what is the value of this green fertilizer on the market. There is a value, and we need to push this value. The last point is the partnership and the supports. So launching this business needs supports today. And it's important not only to work on the demand side, so to have targets on CO2 emission, for example, but it's also working on the supply side. Supply side means having some helps, some subsidies to support the project. And there is different mechanisms today that are developing worldwide on with different type of mechanism depending on the countries to support the project. So here is the main issues that we are facing on the development of on some projects and how we are dealing it today.
Very good.
I just wanted to give Bill 5 minutes to wrap it up, because we are going to skip the break and go directly to the second panel. And if you have burning questions.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you all the speakers. So those were very interesting presentations. It's great to hear from the people in the industry actually doing these projects and the leadership in all these areas. We do, as Michelle said, have a very limited amount of time here. But I do want to ask a couple of key questions. And there was some discussion earlier around the infrastructure. And to me, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of what's likely to happen. And I'd really like to get the panelists' thoughts on how we see the need for infrastructure going forward. And a key question of this is, what are we moving in general? Are we generally moving electricity and doing more of the actual hydrogen production at locations, and then not moving the hydrogen, much like the cases of the projects, some of the projects we saw that look like very big batteries effectively? Or are we actually going to be moving the chemicals, the hydrogen or hydrogen in some form of carrier in very big ways? And is that going to be moving hydrogen, or is it going to be moving other molecules like Trevor was just talking about? So I'd like to just open that up for what I hope will be somewhat short answers, since we have limited time, but I'm sure people could talk about this for quite a while. So let me just open the floor to that and ask the panelists to jump in with their thoughts. If I could just put your visionary hats on, what do you think is likely in the future?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in and say that, I think we're moving toward large centralized production, which really lends itself to moving molecules. So, Trevor talked about, the idea of, kind of transporting hydrogen in the form of ammonia. I think that as we go to these large projects, like the NEOM project and some of the other really large, centralized production projects, you're going to be moving molecules and you're not going to be moving electricity around to make the molecules.
Yeah, just agree with Stephen on that. I think what we are seeing opportunities for is really the hub and spoke model. And so how do you create hydrogen hubs, really more production centers, utilization centers, and then the spokes being looking at opportunity for transportation, either via pipeline and or through vehicle transport of that. And again, some of the projects that we proposed and we're working on today are employing just that method. I think the last thing I'll say is right now, all the technologies, everything we're talking about, again, are commercially mature. These are not first of a kind technologies. It's really first of a kind market applications. And so trying to drive scale here commensurately to reduce costs is very important in these early stages. That doesn't mean in 15, 20 plus years from now, we won't have more of a decentralized model. But I think in the outgoing piece right now, getting scale is critically important, and that lends more towards a centralized model.
Yeah, if I can complete Michael's views, I deeply share your view, Michael and Stefan. There will be some places where there will be very large scale installation, because the place where you can have cheap electricity are scarce in the world. So desert may be the good place to have this large scale installation. And what do you do then? You need to transport this hydrogen. So you will see some infrastructure, pipes, but also a long distance transportation. How it will be done, it's really depend on the location. And also there is no clue today on the way you can transport hydrogen on long distance. Some are betting on ammonia, other on liquefied hydrogen. It's really depend on the specific local issues also. So building this, this infrastructure and syncing this infrastructure now by also the conversion of some existing installation is very an important issue. And that's what we are working on at European level, for example, with the backbone. It's a map with the development of big infrastructure pipes to connect the different hubs together.
Well, I might just add a last thought. I think an interesting way to think of it is to remember that the marginal decarbonization, the next cheapest, most efficient thing we could do, might not, if we kept doing the next most cheap, most efficient thing, ever lead us to a resilient 100% carbon-free grid. We might have to do something that's actually not very efficient and not the cheapest thing in order that we come up with a solution that allows deep decarbonization. If we keep doing incremental solutions, we hit a roadblock. And so when you talk about, which is going to be the infrastructure, I think first we're going to have multiple infrastructures. We're always going to have the electricity grid. We're always going to have very large gas carriers carrying molecules around the world, whether it's heavy, whether it's crude oil today or coal, or in the future, hopefully it will be something renewable. But how we integrate those in a way that is rational is really the challenge of this decade, is to try and figure out how do we get to 2050, on the trajectory we need without going down too many dead ends.
Yep. Very good point. And let me give Philippe the last word here, just a related question of the of whether Plug is, I think you guys are looking at liquid hydrogen carrying, and you're already distributing a lot of hydrogen. Is that how you see it in the near term, Philippe?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at total volumes, I think large centralized production is going to dwarf all of the small installations, but I think it's going to be a combination. In the near term, we don't need this. Not every customer needs a ton a day of hydrogen. It starts small until they can grow into it. And so I do see opportunities for small on-site generation opportunities where we more transfer electrons. It's going to be market specific in certain areas until it really reaches scale. But yes, Plug Power is committed to, we will be building a infrastructure across the United States. We're at 6 plants right now, liquefied hydrogen plants to cover all markets. And we are looking at similar plants in Europe as well. But we are also doing, smaller projects where we connect directly, interconnect with the grid, or take stranded electrons. So I think it's going to be a combination. But in terms of pure volume, I think centralized plants will be the major player.
Well, thank you very much, all of you panelists, and including Bill Acker, and appreciate. And as you know, all of you is actually in France and in the wee, almost the night, and appreciate you coming on all of you coming on and engaged in a very lively discussion. We have to move on. Thank you very much. Sorry, to our next panel, and I invite Emma Leigel to come on. Emma, can you unmute yourself? And
hello, Michelle. How are you doing? All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Leigel, and I am the legal fellow with the PACE Energy and Climate Center. The Climate Center has been a leader working at the intersection of energy and the environment for over 30 years. And obviously, this expertise has led us to engage in these important conversations around the scaling of green and low carbon hydrogen to achieve state and national economy-wide decarbonization goals. Aware of time, we're going to jump right into introductions from our 3 panelists. We brought together a panel with varied perspectives on policy and regulatory needs to lead us into scaling for hydrogen. And so we'll start with Rachel Thackeray from NRDC. Rachel.
Thank you, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Thackeray. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Natural Resources Defense Council. We've been doing a lot of thinking on how hydrogen fits into kind of the deep decarbonization picture, and trying to devise or figure out what to support in terms of policies. So I think for today, I don't have any slides. What I thought would be best for me to kind of lay out a narrative for how NRDC is thinking about this. And this is such a new space, and I'll get to this in a bit, but the policy space is turning out to be a really interesting and quite intricate world. So I think today I'll be posing more questions than I think I'll be answering. So I always like to start any introduction to hydrogen with a factoid that I think really underscores just how big this is getting. And that is that by 2025, the countries that will have some sort of a national hydrogen strategy or roadmap will cover more than 80% of GDP. The US will be the only major economy without a document. And this gives you a sense of how big this is getting, but also that the US will likely produce something of the sort in the near term. And of course, in New York in particular, there's been some really interesting momentum towards hydrogen that is creating some really interesting kind of policy regulatory questions. In fact, I do think that hydrogen is kind of putting forth some of the most complex kind of policy related questions and kind of brain scratching questions. Because on the one hand, renewable storage, EVs, those are easy. We know we need a ton of those, so we can kind of, go all in terms of policy support and incentives and all those things. Hydrogen is much more tricky. On the one hand, it has this really great potential to help us decarbonize some of the most challenging sectors that may not have better alternatives. So this suggests that we need to be bold, especially in this decade, as we need to build experience and improve the technology and all that, such that it's ready to be used in 2030 onwards. On the other hand, there are some pitfalls that warrant caution. In particular, and we'll get to those kind of related to some of the production pathways that are being put forth as potential solutions, but may have some climate issues, public health issues. Other pitfalls relate to potential applications. It has some great applications, but it has some applications where it could work, but doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of economics, climate impacts, and all these sort of things. So all these kind of potential downsides suggest that we need to be more cautious. So you have this kind of tension in the policy world where on the one hand, we need to be bold and develop the solutions for the climate crisis. On the other hand, we need to be cautious and make sure that we have all the information we need to produce some of the most kind of effective policies in the near term. So, and I think New York is becoming the battleground for a lot of these considerations. As you know, a lot of projects are being proposed, you have opposition, boosters, and I think it really gets at the core of this tension point. I do want to end by saying that, we can't get this wrong at this point. We don't have time to get it wrong and kind of correct course. We're already really in the red alert zone. This decade is extremely consequential in terms of our action on climate. So we need to be very consciously developing policy frameworks that channel this really great resource from the outset into its highest value places. And we need to be developing the right guiding principles to get it right from the start. So some kind of high level pieces here, and we'll get to those during the conversation, I'm sure. I think the first question needs to be, how does this all fit into the big deep decarbonization picture? And I think Trevor just expressed this well when he said we cannot look at incremental solutions anymore. And I completely agree. We need to be looking at how hydrogen fits into the big picture, as opposed to trying to kind of force it into places where it may not make some great sense. And then based on this kind of initial vision setting, then we can kind of start thinking around, well, in the near term, what can we do? What sort of no regret applications we can target? And then for the longer term, kind of figure out what sort of policies we can put in today to help scale up this resource for things like maritime shipping and aviation, where there's still a lot of questions and R&D needs to happen. And I do want to end by saying that there are some legitimate concerns around hydrogen. I know we have a few, and those should be taken very seriously. But I do think that we should not be pushing this off the table too prematurely on account of some of these concerns, and instead adopt a more kind of comprehensive and constructive approach to trying to devise strategies, policies that address some of these concerns. So with that, back to you, Emma, and really excited for the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'll introduce our second panelist, Bob Wyman, who is a beneficial electrician advocate and an independent intervener in utility rate cases. Bob?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for including me in this fascinating conversation. Probably the most, I am beneficial electrification advocate, primarily focused on the heating problem, heating of space and water in buildings. But probably most relevant to this meeting, I think I'm an individual intervener in the utility rate cases that actually set the electric and gas rates in Westchester County and define many of the operational requirements for the utilities that operate there, Con Ed, NYSEG, et cetera. Without question, I think as we've heard today, hydrogen has a great many really good applications. particularly from my point of view, the use of hydrogen as a battery, as a means for storing electricity is particularly interesting. As Mike Ducker pointed out, in the future, we won't be seeing curtailment of renewables in the winter when we have a tremendous need for heating our homes and also for charging our electric vehicles. What we're going to have is we're going to have large deficits in renewable supply, and those deficits could be addressed if we had a way of doing long-term storage, essentially storing the excess electricity that we may be producing during the summer and holding it over so that we can generate electricity during the winter. Hydrogen can help provide that kind of long-term storage and really make the vision of renewables feasible. But while hydrogen has many great applications, and I could probably go on for another half hour just listing them. What I want to do here is I want to talk today about one application that should not use hydrogen, something for which hydrogen is absolutely not suited. And it's important to understand that just because hydrogen is great for some applications, or even many applications, that doesn't mean it's great or even good for all applications. Specifically, I'm impressed by all the research that makes it very clear that hydrogen should not be delivered as piped gas for heating of space and water in homes and buildings. Electricity used in heat pumps provides much more efficient heating and cooling. As we heard in an earlier section, they described the challenge we're facing in producing sufficient clean electricity. Well, either blue or green hydrogen production requires a tremendous amount of electricity. If we were to switch the gas utilities from methane to hydrogen, or even larger quantities of hydrogen mixed in with something like renewable natural gas, we might need to either double or triple the amount of electricity that we'd need, say, by 2050. Double the amount that we'd need instead of, say, switching from natural gas to electricity to be used for heating within heat pumps and also electricity to be used in vehicles. It's hard enough to supply the electricity for electric vehicles and heat pumps that we already know that we're going to need in the future. There is no way that we'll be able to produce enough electricity to also switch all the other, basically switch the out the methane that's in our gas networks and replace it with hydrogen. We just can't produce enough electricity to make that possible. But one thing that's important to understand too is that even if we did switch out all the natural gas and replace it with hydrogen, we'd still need electricity for all the applications that that people use natural gas for today. For instance, if you're heating your home, you still need electricity to run your fans and blowers to distribute the heat within your home. If you've got a stove, you probably have an electric pilot system, so you need electricity to turn the stove on. Okay, so what we'd have to do if we did switch to hydrogen is, first of all, you have to replace all those appliances, because if you have more than, say, 10 or 15% hydrogen concentration in your gas supply, you have to replace all of your burners and all your appliances and things. You also have to fix all the pipes because they're leak prone. You have to change all the pressure regulators on all the connections to the set. It's a tremendous amount of cost. But most importantly, what you're doing is you're maintaining a system that has two critical points of failure. If either electricity or gas, hydrogen in this case, are interrupted for some reason, you have no ability to heat your home or to cook your food. It doesn't make sense to build a system that has two critical failure points when in fact we can build a cheaper system that has only one critical failure point, and we can work a great deal at making sure that that failure point is as resilient as possible. It's also important to note that no one, neither at the gas utilities in New York State, nor in the Department of Public Service staff or anyone else, has put forward even a hint of a plan showing that sufficient hydrogen can be produced to displace enough natural gas to allow the utilities to meet the CLCPA goals of a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 or an 85% reduction by 2050. Given that, it doesn't make sense to invest today in expensive infrastructure whose costs simply cannot be recovered from what will inevitably be a declining user base over the next 30 years. We're going to end up with very expensive stranded assets that we'll have no one to pay for them. So we're either talking about bankrupting the gas utilities after a couple of years, or we're talking about taxpayers coming in and paying off the cost of assets that were put in place that should have had maybe a 50, 60 or longer year useful life, but in fact we've cut them off after only 29 years because that's what the law says we have to do. And we would have to abandon all of the hydrogen assets if hydrogen cannot make it possible for the gas utilities to accomplish their 85% reduction by 2050. And remember too, that 85% reduction is not an 85% reduction from today's consumption of natural gas. That's an 85% reduction from the 1990 level of gas consumption, which means that it's much greater than 85% reduction. Essentially, the CLCPA says, unless you can figure out how to have absolutely carbon-free gas, you got to shut down the gas network. As Trevor said, we shouldn't be investing in incremental solutions unless they're on the path to the full solution we need. So we shouldn't even consider investing in hydrogen for natural gas, for what are today natural gas systems, until somebody can present us with a plan that says that there is going to be, with great with our ability to rely on it, there is going to be enough electricity, enough renewable natural gas, enough whatever, to ensure that those assets will be able to have a reasonably long life. Now, if I could just point out here too, hydrogen, RNG, or renewable natural gas in general, they may be, they attract a lot of attention from the utilities because essentially the utilities are looking for what one might politely call a business continuation plan, a strategy for staying in business. So it's a way to allow their assets to maintain value in the future. The problem is that the cost to society of protecting those companies will be tremendous. We've got, 1,000, well, in the country at the moment, we have 2.3 million miles of utility gas pipes. We've got 300,000 miles of transmission pipelines. That's all very expensive stuff. But if we start using high percentages of hydrogen in those pipes, we're going to have to replace most of them anyway. We can't bear that cost. Frankly, we should be primarily focused on the needs of society, not on the needs of the small number of companies. We need to find another way to address their financial issues and provide them with business continuation plans. One which has often been proposed is to get them into the business of geothermal district heating, essentially have them pump heat instead of pumping gas. Society's needs are going to be best served by abandoning gas of any kind for heating our homes and buildings. And if I could just make one last comment here, I just want to point out something and understand that I'm a great supporter of hydrogen for non-piped gas utility applications, okay? But still, it's often been said that hydrogen is clean, okay? Well, it actually would be more accurate to say that hydrogen is cleaner, not that it's clean. Just like CO2, methane, etc., hydrogen, if it's leaked, has a global warming impact. It's on a mass basis, the global warming impact over 100 years for hydrogen is about 5.8 relative to CO2's 1. And obviously that's a lot less than the 26 or so for methane. Its global warming potential over 20 years, which is what we legally have to pay attention to in New York, is about 13. Still a lot less than methane, a lot more than CO2. It is important to note that because hydrogen is a much lighter molecule than CO2, on a volume basis, that means that that actually means that hydrogen's GOP for a given volume of gas is probably about 25 to 50% of that of CO2. So yes, that's much, much cleaner than CO2. But we have to remember that doesn't mean that it's quote unquote clean. Okay, there's still a problem here. It's much like the issue we were talking about in the chat box about NOx. NOx, or let's say NO2, doesn't itself have global warming potential, but if it's in the atmosphere combining with other things, it will tend to produce things like ozone, which do have very high global warming potential. Hydrogen is the same way. Hydrogen in the atmosphere tends to interfere with the with the breakdown of methane, which essentially extends the life of methane, and also hydrogen when burned, which is another problem, tends to produce NOx, which has a high global warming potential. So essentially my message is hydrogen has many wonderful applications. The one thing we must not do is we must not use hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas in our gas utility system. That is absolutely the wrong thing to do. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And so our final panelist is Gail Schumann, who is a partner at Shepherd Mullins. And in awareness of time, Gail, is part of your, after your introduction, if you have kind of any response to what has kind of just been said by Bob about possibly, not pursuing certain applications, and whether that really kind of works with the idea of needing to transition. So are we able to really transition from the current system while fully avoiding, replacement of natural gas with hydrogen? So Gail, please do your introduction.
Yes, it looks like I'm the last presenter of the day, so I'll try not to be too redundant and hopefully not too boring. My name is Gail Suchman. I've been an environmental lawyer for over 30 years in both the public and private sectors. And at Shepherd Mullin, I do a lot of work in the energy space. We do a lot of work on the renewable side, and we're active in advising clients on investments in green hydrogen. And some of our West Coast partners are actually active in the Green Hydrogen Coalition. As you heard from Dr. Nelson, it's really a wonderful organization. I'll make my comments extremely brief and try to focus on what Emma asked me to do. I don't disagree with Bob Wyman regarding use of hydrogen burning in boilers in buildings. But I do want to talk a little bit about the transition and sort of follow up on what Rachel said. There is a growing market for distributed hydrogen production in the U.S. now through the use, or really worldwide, through the use of fuel cells and other types of electrolyzers paired with power generation and industrial processes. And as we know, well, we've heard about all these wonderful projects, IPP, the south of France, the great Mitsubishi technology. The most current production of hydrogen still relies on natural gas for its production. And as the US and the States and the rest of the world moves towards more renewables feeding into the grid, or by pairing hydrogen production with renewable generation or biofuels, as we've discussed, there should be substantial expansion of the use of hydrogen, green hydrogen. But that transition, it is a transition, and it's not a short transition. It's a fairly lengthy transition, whether it's we think it's 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. To transition to 100% green energy system and green industrial system is going to be difficult. And that transition itself is of concern to, as Rachel said, to environmental advocates, and particularly to environmental justice advocates. I don't have any answers to that now because if you want to keep the lights on and you want to keep industry going, there's a philosophy that you're going to need natural gas for the transition for a decent amount of time. But that transition in and of itself is of great concern and should not be forgotten. There are also other many questions, as we also have discussed, regarding infrastructure, storage, above ground storage, underground storage, transport through pipelines. Can we use the existing infrastructure? Lots of people say we can. Lots of people say we can't. Can we transform the existing infrastructure, or do we have to build new infrastructure? That's the issue of whether or not we go to decentralized systems or centralized systems. And I think it was Trevor, or definitely people on the last panel said it's probably going to be, or Mike Dugar, that it's going to be a mixture of both. Siting and permitting is a huge factor. How will we assess the impacts of hydrogen production, particularly looking at climate impacts over a life cycle. And that addresses some of Bob's concerns about leakage. We have tank regulation, underground injection regulation. EPA already has a very robust regulatory regime for underground injection, pipeline safety. And apart from government regulation, we've got private rights, private land rights and water rights. But the Biden infrastructure bill holds a lot of promise for the expansion of the hydrogen market, through research and development and through pilots and through the tax credits. In December, DOE announced what now seems to be a very modest amount, $33 million of R&D money specifically for hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, and now subsumed in a $35 billion R&D fund under the Biden infrastructure plan. It's going to provide monies for hydrogen as well. There are hydrogen demonstration projects that are proposed, and most importantly, the expanded tax credits, which always advances technology. The tax credits are proposed to be extended over 10 years, refundable, to provide investment certainty, which is so very important, and hopefully will include standalone storage, production and storage facilities. Right now, storage facilities don't have a standalone tax credit. They have to be coupled with a wind or solar or geothermal project. And finally, the huge commitment that Biden is making towards electric vehicles, $174 billion. And there is no definition yet to electric vehicles. So is it going to just include batteries, or will it include hydrogen fuel cells cars as well? A couple of things to note for the future. I view hydrogen potential coupled with offshore wind as a real possibility. The question is the offshore wind is going to be along the Northeast coast, close to electricity constrained cities, high density cities with large diverse populations. Is it possible to build a hydrogen production facility in New York? Does it have to be on a platform? And R&D will really help with that. So this transition is long term, and we have to watch the transition and try to include as many people in the discussion as we can about this transition. But without diminishing the incredible projects that people talked about today and the incredible potential opportunity for hydrogen in the long term.
Great. Thank you so much, Gail, and thank you all three of you for your introductions. I think just from your statements, we begin to see just how complex the considerations are in determining initial policy frameworks for how to move forward, given the various production methods and possible applications. And so I would open up the conversation going back to kind of our initial discussion about possible pathways, and from all three of your different perspectives, starting with Rachel, the policy frameworks that are really being discussed and considered right now to begin moving forward, and what are those initial policies and that are being considered?
Yeah, so the U.S. is lagging compared to Europe in terms of setting up a policy framework for the support of hydrogen. So far, I would say private industry has been leading much of the efforts, and there are some really exciting projects popping up. However, there are some policies that are certainly budding across different states. So for example, of course, New York, owing to its progressive climate platform, we're seeing a lot of activity here, California as well. So I think both New York and California are currently looking at how to treat hydrogen under their kind of climate policies. In California, there's discussion around, should it be considered under a clean energy standard as a compliant resource? I believe New York is kind of embarking into the same questions. Would it count as a clean energy resource? If so, in which form? Combustion, fuel cells? What is really green? So a lot of kind of these conversations around how to fit it into the landmark kind of climate policy of the state. In California, a really interesting kind of ongoing conversation is around how do you define green? I think Dr. Nelson previously mentioned Senate Bill 18 in California currently kind of directing state agencies to consider green hydrogen kind of as how it could help the state meet its goals and kind of produce a strategic plan for accelerating deployment. But the main question is, how are we defining green, right? And I completely agree with what I think Trevor said earlier, that we need to move away from colors into more carbon kind of emissions metrics for different pathways, because green can invite a lot of pathways that could have some detrimental impacts, or B, some uncertain impacts. You have to remember, we're trying to move away from a established way of producing hydrogen to new ways in some fashion. And we don't have a good record of some of these production pathways, like, for example, hydrogen production from biomass, right? It could be clean. It could end up being very good for public health, but we just don't know. And there are some important considerations there that we need to go in first, some assessments, better understanding, more record before we can call it green and start incentivizing it. So that's a really interesting conversation in California, and I have a sense it's going to trickle into other states, but also into federal policy as we start thinking about production tax credits, as Gail just mentioned, which resources would get the credit. So this is the kind of definition conversation is extremely important and worth keeping an eye on. And I think at the federal level, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, at the federal level, it's still lagging, although I think folks mentioned President Biden's interest in this. A tax credit is the one that is being floated the most, in particular for electrolyzers, so for the electrolytic version of it, as well as some spending measures. So assisting existing users like refiners and fertilizer producers in their switch from gray hydrogen to green. This is really exciting. This is kind of the most no regret way of scaling up the industry without popping into some of those uncertainties that I think Gail and Bob laid out really, really well.
I wanted to add something, Emma, is that all right?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I talked about transition and how important it was to include all concerned people in the discussion. And that means also that when we talk about green hydrogen, we do have to deal with the necessary transition that the NISO presented. That was a great presentation to show the reality of how people need electricity, and there needs to be a logical transition. So while I agree with everything that the focus ultimately will be on the definition that's in SB 18 with no hydrogen having any involvement with fossil fuels, it still is a reality that has to be dealt with, and that needs to be part of the discussion as well.
Emma, could I make a comment here?
Yes.
Yeah. It is important that we look, at transitions and transitional technologies, but it's important to remember that just because something is a transition doesn't mean you don't have to pay for it. Anything we do which is transitional must be paid for. Its costs have to be recovered by somebody. And this is the problem we run up against when we're dealing with the rate cases here in New York State, because the gas utilities, for instance, to make the investments in new pipelines or interconnects to sources of renewable natural gas or electrolyzers or whatever, many of the assets, particularly the pipes, to make them affordable, they want to recover their costs over an 85-year period. The difficulty here with that, and in the past, that's what they've done for natural gas pipes. So it's logical that they would want to continue that. But the problem is that if we're talking about a transitional technology, we have to think, well, when will we recover those costs? Will we still be doing whatever it is we're doing 85 years from now? The reality is that if we have to have a dramatic reduction of emissions from the gas network by 2050, and we've got 85-year lifetime equipment, we should have stopped installing that transitional equipment back in 1965, okay? That's when the last sort of new transitional natural gas pipe should have been put in. Or if we're talking about hydrogen here is a transition, that's when the last hydrogen pipe should have been installed. What we need to do now the alternative is we could say, okay, we'll put a whole lot of money into improving the infrastructure so that we can move hydrogen without leaks and the rest. And remember, if you will, Con Ed, who serves Westchester County right now, plans to spend $1 billion a year, every year for the next 3 years in maintenance and update on its existing gas network. Okay, that's what it costs today. It'll be higher if they do hydrogen for the gas utilities, because we're switching to heat pumps and we're doing a lot of other such things. So we're going to be carrying that 85-year-long cost and having fewer and fewer people pay it as every year passes, and we have more people switch to zero-emission heat pump systems. What's going to happen is that the cost of being on the gas system is going to go up tremendously. Okay, you can't have a smaller number of people using less of a product cover the same cost for 85 years without seeing their costs go up dramatically. We could very soon get to the point where gas was free. This is one of the things that frustrates me about, all the work that's been done on the efficiency of gas generation, because yeah, we might be able to produce hydrogen much more cheaply and much more efficiently than we do today. We might be able to do the same with RNG, but as long as the user base is declining, we might get to the point where gas, was free, but the costs of the infrastructure itself were causing the cost of being a gas customer to go out of sight. We should be focusing on using hydrogen for the things that it is most valuable for. Okay, things like storage for electricity, things like powering vehicles that can't otherwise, at least at the moment, be powered by electricity, chemical processes, and all sorts of other things, displacing fossil fuel from the chemical and pharmaceutical industry, as at least where they need hydrogen. Replacing the use of fossil fuel as a hydrogen source for ammonia production. These are all really important things to do and valuable things to do. We don't need hydrogen as a transition strategy for the gas network. That's a really dumb use of hydrogen, and one which will end up producing vast quantities of stranded assets that somebody is going to have to pay for, and it's probably going to end up being taxpayers.
Thank you, Bob. We have to wrap up in 2 minutes for Michel to do a full wrap up of the event. And so I would just end our discussion. Obviously, there's so many points being made on multiple sides of this conversation that we could keep diving into in much more detail. And so I would ask the three of you if there was a kind of single initial policy or regulatory item that from your perspectives is the kind of most important to pursue right now. What might that be?
I'm happy to start. I would say due diligence is absolutely necessary. We've used this for a long time in industry, fertilizer refineries, sure, but we're trying to. And we need to, as I mentioned earlier, besides kind of trying to answer those questions, like Bob was mentioning the greenhouse gas impact or potential for leakage or NOx emissions, all these different things, we also need to understand where it fits, as I mentioned. And I think Bob again said that right now, that it has these really great applications that we need to kind of focus on. So I think first and foremost, robust knowledge base is necessary as PUCs start revising and kind of reviewing applications for new, hydrogen-based plants, or the future of heat that National Grid is trying to pursue in New York around trying to transition its gas system to hydrogen. There needs to be this knowledge base. And then afterwards, I think, in terms of what we can do more concretely, look for no regret applications. Look for applications that will occur, and that are robust and consistent no matter what future we're envisioning for hydrogen. That is what Europe is starting to look into, and it's really interesting. Is existing users that use hydrogen, those are not going away for a long time. Let's start by transitioning those into green hydrogen. This will scale up the industry significantly without trying to solve for things where the knowledge is still quite thin. So I would start with due diligence, no regret applications.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think we need to look at hydrogen as a valuable, rare, precious resource, okay, relative to the total needs of all combustibles, okay?
Bob, can you just...
And we need to prioritize the use of hydrogen and make sure that it's only used in the best applications.
I wanted to let you know that I will leave the event on for another half an hour. So you may continue this conversation. What I wanted to do is thank you so much, all of you, to come and speak to this event, and all of you for attending this event. This is just the first. I wanted to come back perhaps in the fall with another of these kind of sessions, perhaps focusing on special uses of hydrogen. And one of them that is close to my heart is going to be how to create alternative fuels from recycling, for instance, hydrogen, or let's say recycling jet fuel that there are uses today you can't really replace. There are uses for hydrogen you can make happen. For instance, if you combine carbon dioxide and hydrogen, I have a dear friend on this event now attending, you can create anything you want, which you can't really replace today. Really, you cannot put a large lithium-ion batteries on the airplane. We're doing that already. You can perhaps do other things, but it's going to be a difficult transition, as Gail say, in the transition. So we'll do another event like this, hopefully in the fall, hopefully in person. Although I find this a lot more efficient in all ways. If you want to be efficient and carbon, low carbon, this is an amazing event. Thank you very much, all of you, and looking forward. Keep on going, Bob. I'm sorry to interrupt, and I'll be out of the way, as we call. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Bob, did you want to kind of finish your thoughts, and then Gail will finish with you?
So no, I think I said it. I totally agree with Rachel. I think we need to view hydrogen as a precious, rare resource, and we need to manage it as what it is, as a precious, rare resource, and make sure that it isn't squandered on silly applications. And frankly, a replacement for natural gas as piped gas, that isn't the way one uses a resource which has the potential that this one does. So the policy I would suggest is a policy that does what she suggested, that prioritizes, discovers the applications, prioritizes them, and attempts to manage the process by which we use hydrogen in our energy system.
And I agree with what Rachel and Bob said. I think that there is a lot of great uses that are maybe available, that are going to become available in the short term as more renewable energy sources become available. And I do think that pairing with the industry processes or natural gas CTGs, all of that can be done in the more short term while we're studying the issues of infrastructure for centralized systems, with the storage tanks and pipelines. So I think I know there's a lot of discussion that we shouldn't do this incrementally, but I think that there's a way to take advantage of hydrogen use also in automobiles and transportation, as Michelle said earlier, and then look at some of the longer term uses that will cost a lot more money and require a lot more infrastructure.
Could I make one other comment? Yeah, and that is this. There's sometimes when you're I've got a lot of history in the computer business where we introduce new technologies and products. And one of the things you always want to do is avoid problems you don't need to be constantly on the edges. And I would suggest it's just not useful to encourage opposition from the environmental community. There are so many applications for hydrogen that literally nobody's going to object to. But the moment people start talking about pipelines, extending the life of gas pipelines, encouraging expansion of gas supply in cities, et cetera, okay, you immediately attract the attention of like literally every environmentalist for hundreds of miles around wherever that's being discussed. And it's just not worth it, okay? There are so many things that you can do in which you essentially are talking only about like, what can we do? How do we finance this? How do we move forward in a positive way, as opposed to having to spend all your time defending your technology and your approach and saying, yes, yes, but I've got these other things which are also good. It just isn't worth it from an industry point of view to have to deal with fighting the environmentalists. Why don't you just stay away from that application? And then frankly, the environmentalists will all be on your side and they'll be powering you forward instead of trying to hold you back. And anybody who's in New York knows that the environmentalists in New York are making life very difficult for the hydrogen people. It is totally unnecessary. Okay, absolutely unnecessary.
I don't know. I wasn't advocating anything that was, using natural gas pipelines. So I was advocating what can be done in a clean way as we move towards more renewable sources on the grid, or pairing hydrogen production with renewable resources. So I agree with you. I agree with you. That's why I said something about being careful about transition and bringing as many people into the conversation as possible.
And I think, Gail, that this type of conversation is just that type of conversation that needs to be had to really be moving us forward. And so I want to thank all three of you for being here today and engaging in this conversation. I believe Michel is still on. And so thank you to him and Sustainable Westchester for putting this entire event together. And hopefully we see a number of you back for the next event that we schedule for later in the year. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm open to anyone to stay on. Anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask direct questions, that will be fine.
Hey, I have a question. So are there technologies in place to control the NOx emissions of hydrogen if we were to use it in a combustion application?
Who wants to take it?
I'm happy to jump in there. So this is Mike Ducker with Mitsubishi. And yes, I mean, going back to the presentation I showed, we've already achieved upwards of 100% hydrogen utilization in our gas turbines dating back to the 1970s. Our entire focus today is achieving the same ultra low levels of NOx of 2 ppm in today's combustion gas turbines, which is required, for natural gas. I don't know if you saw in the chat post, but I did put some comments there about NOx, where today's gas turbines are at on NOx and how that relates to an industry as a whole. But the main story here, the message is absolutely NOx is a very important pollutant that we have to address. But the good news is, as we continue to look to retire older infrastructure, coal-fired units, oil-fired units, even gas-fired units that have been around for some time, convert them to today's latest state-of-the-art technologies, we'll actually have a significant net reduction in NOx emissions for these types of facilities.
Anyone else?
I have another question on combustion turbines and using hydrogen in them. Because the hydrogen heat rate is lower than natural gas heat rate, how does that work? Like, do you need to run the turbine longer or compress the gas more? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, so hydrogen basically is about takes about three times more volume than natural gas, and so really at the core, our approach on designing the combustion systems of gas turbines is actually controlling the combustion temperature. And so in doing so and achieving the same temperatures as today's gas turbines, there actually will not be any type of impact necessarily on efficiencies nor output for the same model engine. We are putting through then more volume of gas, but actually much less mass of gas. So hydrogen on a mass basis has a lot more energy than natural gas. So what this ultimately ends up requiring is rather simple design changes in the gas turbine. So we need larger diameter piping, larger valving, larger gas turbine enclosures because we've got bigger volumes of gas coming through. But again, as far as the design or what we've done from an efficiency and power standpoint, it's targeting at those same temperatures that our gas turbine blades and vanes see on natural gas. And this is just a fundamental design philosophy that Japan and our parent company has taken to try to minimize the amount of retrofits and other types of rework that would be necessary in today's gas turbines.
Thank you.
Does the fact that the gas just burns at like half the temperature make any difference in the turbines? You're saying it doesn't?
No, and so actually there's some unique items with hydrogen, particularly as we start talking about startup shutdown and transient stages of operating on hydrogen. The flame is, typically we're actually trying to avoid flame out on natural gas, but with hydrogen it's a bit more stable, particularly these lower operating ranges. And so we're actually looking, exploring every steam generator in the back end. That's where we're boiling water and using the waste heat coming off the back end of the gas turbine to produce steam for a steam turbine. But no, there's no hydrogen going in any boilers or anything like that.
I mean, that's one of the things when we were just briefly just chatting before. There's a lot of physics around some of this stuff, and I obviously don't understand a lot of the application issues, but it has about a third of the BTUs of a propane or a natural gas. It has half the burning temperature. I think it was at 900 and some odd degrees versus 1900. And so those are all things. Those are all part of the physics. It likes to dissolve certain steel pipes and stuff like that. And just pure hydrogen.
Yeah, and I think this is where, as Rachel was mentioning it, it's really important that we just have these open dialogues and have meetings like this to talk about it. And so, look, even the hydrogen embrittlement, we hear about it all the time. Again, understand that we've got 1,700 miles of 100% hydrogen pipelines that have been being operated in the United States for decades right now. They go through major cities like Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Houston, Texas. Most people don't realize that the infrastructure exists today, and for good reason, because luckily we haven't had big issues with leakage and explosions and other items. This isn't to minimize the concerns of hydrogen. Absolutely, it's something we have to be careful of, and we have to be cautious. But the good news is, we've got best practices and codes and standards in the United States with decades of experience in the petrochemicals industry that we can rely on as we look at applying those same philosophies in the power industry and elsewhere.
Bert, you wanted to ask a question.
I actually had a comment. I've enjoyed this panel and these panels very much. So I'm with facilities at Cornell University, the Ithaca campus, large campus. We have two 15 megawatt electric combustion gas turbines. But we're committed to a carbon neutral campus by 2035. And one thing I think that's important, and for the systems that are talked about here, is that when electricity is used in electrolysis to make the hydrogen, that it be actually carbon free. And that's not easy to know. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out what the marginal emission rate of the grid is. And when if you add load to the grid, it's natural gas that a plant somewhere picks up the load, or when there might be curtailed solar or wind or hydro, that picks up the load. And of course, you want the latter so that it's carbon-free electricity running the electrolysis unit. It's not easy to get. We've modeled the system. We've used contractors to model the system. New York ISO does not provide that data yet. They may in the future when there's a carbon price put on wholesale bulk electricity. Now the system we're using is a commercial proprietary system used called WattTime, WattTime. They're out of California. California uses them for battery dispatch. So that's the best we have right now. And it's basically an artificial intelligence, carbon-free electricity off the grid, and not easy to know when you're doing that. With real physics, you can get renewable energy credits to offset the carbon, but that's a little different. That's all. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Michelle,
just
can
to
I make a
comment
comment on that?
Rachel?
Yeah, just quickly wanted to say, Bert, this is exactly the sort of questions we're asking ourselves as we define, what is green hydrogen? How can you ensure that you're not creating issues elsewhere? So it was really interesting to hear you kind of how you're thinking about it, and just wanted to note how important that is in the policy space currently.
Bill, you want to say something?
Yes, yeah, Bert, you brought up a really good point. And I just wanted to mention that this is becoming a very important topic also for tracking the carbon usage of buildings. So Local Law 97 in New York City is looking at how to track carbon usage in buildings. And one of the things that's coming out of the working groups there is a request to the ISO to actually develop this information. And it is tricky. You have to look at imports, you have to look at how things move around, et cetera. But both NYSERDA and New York City are now approaching the ISO and talking about pathways to generate this information in real time. So I can't guarantee it's going to happen next year, but it's certainly something the state's working on.
Thank you. Any other question? Comment?
Yes, I have a question, I guess, towards Bill Bob Wyman. His concern about the use of hydrogen as a heating source for buildings. Is that also, are you also concerned about that as a source of fuel for transportation, for cars? The whole idea of having a hydrogen fuel car, which has been popularized, is that something that also concerns you, Bob?
Well, I think for like just normal sort of light duty vehicles, I think hydrogen, many of the same issues that I have with hydrogen for heating apply to the use of hydrogen for just sort of normal light duty vehicles. On the other hand, there's long haul trucking, there's specialty vehicles, et cetera, in which I think one can make a case for the use of hydrogen. The difficulty is that if you try to produce a hydrogen distribution network, which is large enough and expansive enough to be able to address the needs of the average light duty vehicle, you're essentially going to have to replace most of the existing natural gas network anyway, because either the pipes don't work or they were designed for lower pressure. I mean, if you're pumping hydrogen, you have to use higher pressure or larger pipes throughout your transmission and distribution system. So the cost would be tremendous. The other problem, of course, is from an efficiency point of view. The efficiency of an electric vehicle is dramatically higher than what you can get resources. It wouldn't be wise, but nonetheless, there are, I think, applications for hydrogen. I think in specialized cases, just not in the average sort of light duty vehicle. The thing that's parked in your garage right now at home, that should not be burning hydrogen, even in fuel cells. That should be an electric vehicle. But a lot of other vehicles might, in fact, be well suited to hydrogen.
And Bob, maybe if I could just add on to your point, I think we certainly agree on that sense too. And I think the simple analogy is looking at like the power sector, where we see batteries serving your short duration, intra-daily needs, hydrogen being your longer duration, more heavy duty needs. And from a transportation side, same thing goes for batteries, light duty vehicles. It's going to make a lot more sense. Whereas long haul trucking, heavy haul equipment, et cetera, hydrogen is going to make a lot more sense. And, you know, I forget who said it before, but for trucking, you can haul freight or haul batteries. You can't do both. And the last thing I'll point out just on the transportation side, you know, we've been working with a lot of folks in the transportation sector, which has been an incredibly exciting part of my role right now, because I'm used to the power side. What they see is, you know, a power plant here, like the Intermountain Power Project, we need upwards of 100 metric tons of hydrogen a day type of demand. And that's just that partial use of hydrogen integration. Once we get 100%, it's a lot more. Conversely, long haul trucking, they're looking at, you know, anywhere from 2, 5, maybe upwards of 10 tons a day type of demand at a fueling station. And so if we look at co-locating this infrastructure and that cross-sector, you know, type of synergies, they then can reap the benefits of the economies of scale of some of these power facilities throughout the U.S. And, you know, everything else around that infrastructure, while still, you know, achieving their targets around heavy haul trucking. And so, again, I think this is a interesting part of hydrogen is it's bringing multiple sectors together who historically haven't really talked, or at least, you know, my experience haven't talked to the degree we've been talking here over the course of the past year and a half.
Also, hydrogen, talking about transportation applications, we should remember hydrogen is a great fuel for the kind of transportation systems that NASA, SpaceX, and others produce, and that is rockets. If you want to put something in orbit as a transportation problem, hydrogen is a great fuel for doing that, combined with a little bit of oxygen. But that's a specialized case, you know.
Yeah, and Michelle, I'd like to just comment for a second on the efficiency piece that Bob mentioned. You know, we talked about the stranded assets and all these things, but I think the efficiency piece is absolutely crucial. I think this is one of the main reasons why it would be wise not to pursue hydrogen for, say, buildings or light duty vehicles, is that it is so much less efficient than other kind of direct electrification alternatives. In fact, there's a study that showed that to heat the same building with hydrogen boiler versus a kind of direct electricity, you would require 5 to 6 times more renewable energy. That is huge. And if you look at kind of net zero analyses by Princeton, others that show just how much renewables we need to build by 2050 to meet demands across our economy, it's a whole lot. And we should certainly not be pushing for solutions that are going to multiply this amount of renewables by 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I think this is kind of the guiding principle for a lot of, you know, how we're thinking around what are some interesting applications and what are some applications where it just doesn't make any economic sense to pursue.
And it's in favor of the high value in some applications, like the fuels, where you can't really replace or transition very easily.
Absolutely. Yep.
Any other question? Unless there's any more questions, we're going to start wrapping up here. And thank you again for participating and actively. And I feel we're going to have to do a second one this year, in the fall, to kind of make a point of where we are and somehow. And just to let you know, we have been recording this, and we'll make this event available to participants who wish to have it. You know, looking forward to more discussions in the fall.